right, let's do this. Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope y'all are doing well. So I am out on it's my birthday this week, so I am out at the coast, but I'm still trying to get some work done. So I got my computer set up here. A little sneak preview for what I got coming up. Right there's the thumbnail. But yeah, let me see if I can get you. I got this room here. It's right by the ocean. It's very pretty. I was walking on the beach last night and got scared by some crazy person who was out there in like pitch black, yelling and stuff. Scared the crap out of me. Anyway, I've been taking some videos of just the scenery and such, and working on this new stuff while I'm out here. I'm gonna be heading back home tomorrow, but yeah. I just wanted to upload this video for you. This is the full compilation of the Hell's Invasion series. Finally, all 5 parts combined. And give you a little tour of my room that I'm in. This is like the living room area. There's like a bedroom over there and then bathroom over there. But this is where I'm at now. I got my computer set up right over there. And I'm just chilling. Well, it's been a nice few days. For those of you who have been asking, by the way, this is the microphone I use. It is the AKG C2 or C414. But yeah, anyway, I'm probably gonna throw some other random footage in here from the trip that I've taken, and maybe I'll get some footage out. The microphone cord's not long enough for me to be able to go out there and record, otherwise I'd go open the door. Actually, is it? Let's find out. One sec. Okay, just barely long enough, like just barely. Cool. Anyway, fun story. The other night, I accidentally blasted that screen door off the hinges because I did not know it was open. So I walked right through it, blasted the screen door off its hinges, broke it. It snapped it in half, and I almost fell off the railing. That was fun. So I guess I got to pay them for the new screen door. I don't know. But anyway, I hope y'all are having a great day, and I will be back soon with my next big project. I'm so excited for this one. All right, anyway, see y'all. Oh, also, this is some art that I had commissioned. This is original art by an artist that I know. He's very talented. I'm going to be using that and some different concepts to make some new merch for this story also. Also, this whole thing, like while I've been recording, this is going to be a good test to see if I can tune out the sound of the ocean. If I can do some mixing, because like the ocean is like blasting in the background. Yeah, I mean, like you saw in the video, I think. I'm not sure what got recorded and what didn't. But anyway, yeah, so let's see how this sounds. This has not been recording the entire time I've been talking. What? Damn it, the video wasn't even recording the entire time. Whatever, I'm not doing that again.
I'm not going to tell you much about myself. I won't recount my life story here, if only because it's irrelevant. Suffice to say, I'm an ordinary guy with a well-paid but uninteresting job. A job that allows me to pursue my 2 passions in life, traveling and history. From a young age, I've always been fascinated with history, and particularly military history, having studied the subject in school and college. As an adult, I continue to devour books while using my downtime to visit museums and former battlefields across the globe. I've been everywhere from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Southeast Asia, and have visited institutions as diverse as the Imperial War Museum in London to the Military Museum of the Chinese People's Revolution in Beijing. Some may call it a morbid fascination with death and destruction, but I have a great admiration and respect for those men and women who fought so hard and often gave their lives for causes they held so dear, and I believe their sacrifices should be remembered. Likewise, I'm a great believer in the old adage, a generation which ignores history has no past and no future. In addition to my travels, I am also a member of several online forums and groups along with other military history enthusiasts from various parts of the world. Our aim is not only to engage in lively debate, but also to exchange knowledge and finds. You see, there are many small and obscure military museums dotted across the globe, linked to battles and conflicts which few people are aware of. Often, these small part-time exhibits are run down and of poor quality, but Sometimes we'll find hidden gems telling stories that never made it into the history books. It's finds such as these that we share on the forums for the benefit of our fellow members. It was through one of these threads that I first heard of the Museum of Humanity's Final War. This institution has no online presence or listed phone number, and it's not funded by a federal or state grant. What's more, no one in our group knew what the museum's exhibits consisted of. The name itself was a puzzle, suggesting a prediction of a conflict that may happen in the future. We did manage to find a physical address, but this only added to the mystery. I won't reveal the exact location of the mysterious museum for reasons that will become all too clear. Suffice to say, it's located somewhere in the American Midwest, a site one could fairly describe as the middle of nowhere. Nothing on Google Maps suggested there was a significant building in the vicinity. What's more, there were no battles or even skirmishes in that area we could find. Nothing during the Civil War or any of the numerous conflicts with the Native American tribes. All we really had to go on was a review by one anonymous poster who described his visit to the museum as a life-changing experience, and he strongly recommended a trip to the institution. The whole thing sounded pretty suspicious, and most of the group members wrote it off as a hoax. However, I was still intrigued by the mystery, and, as luck would have it, I was due to attend a work conference in a city about 2 hours' drive from the location. I had a day to kill before my flight home, so I decided to make the trip. I realized it might have been a wild goose chase, but reckoned it was worth taking the chance, just in case I would find a hidden gem. Never in my worst nightmares could I have imagined what I would actually encounter. The drive out that morning was uneventful as I exited the city heading west, soon leaving behind the leafy suburbs before zooming past mile after mile of flat farmland. Following my sat-nav, I left the interstate and found myself driving along a poorly maintained and near-abandoned back road. The farther I got from civilization, the less confident I felt about finding anything of significance out here in the back of beyond. My heart sank when I reached the location and found nothing but a long-abandoned gas station with rusty old pumps and a vandalized forecourt, its glass frontage smashed and interior gutted. I felt like such a tool, having driven all this way for nothing. Nevertheless, I decided to get out of my rental car and take a stroll around the decrepit structure, just on the off chance I would find something of interest. This is when I saw him, a solitary figure emerging from the crumbling forecourt and walking in my direction, with a wide yet somehow sinister smile etched across his face. I took a step back as he approached, his hand outstretched. He was an old-looking individual, dressed in a tweed jacket and tight-fitting waistcoat, and sporting a tidy gray beard and smartly framed spectacles. His wide smile looked put on, and there was a glint in his deep blue eyes which suggested a barely concealed malice. All in all, the man had an unusual appearance, although outwardly he didn't look much different from other eccentric academic types you'd expect to find in offbeat locations. Nevertheless, there was something off about him which put me on edge. He didn't appear to pick up on my discomfort, however, as he continued to hold out his hand while speaking to me in a soft but clearly audible voice. "Good morning, sir. It's my pleasure to meet you. I trust your journey here wasn't too taxing." I didn't want to shake his hand, but felt obligated to do so. His grip was tight and his palm ice cold. I didn't quite know what to say, and so I muttered my reply. No, it was fine, thanks." "Ah, that's good to hear," the man responded enthusiastically, after he eventually released my hand. "Well, sir, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Museum of Humanity's Final War. I'm the curator of this establishment, and it would be my honor to act as your guide for this morning's tour." I was utterly confused by this point. With a number of questions running through my head, I asked the most obvious. "But there's no museum here, is there?" The curator sniggered ever so slightly before replying. "Well, actually there is, sir, although I do understand your confusion. Our institution is in fact located below ground, underneath our feet. We find it's better this way, to keep our institution off the map." This explanation only confused me more. I don't understand. Why wouldn't you want people to know about this place? Don't you want to encourage more visitors? The curator laughed in a dismissive, almost mocking manner. Well, sir, we are not the type of institution that wishes to draw in the masses. We certainly wouldn't want buses full of tourists out here, would we? No, sir, no. We prefer to appeal directly to connoisseurs of conflict such as yourself, those who are willing to make the extra effort to seek us out. Okay, I said uncomfortably. The whole situation raised a lot of red flags, and I was seriously beginning to question my decision to come out here alone. Granted, the curator didn't look like the type who would shoot me in the head so he could steal my car and wallet. Nevertheless, the entire situation was unnerving. There was no way he could have known I was coming today, so why was the man standing out here waiting for me? It didn't make any sense. He seemed to pick up on my discomfort, however, speaking to me in a more sympathetic tone. I can tell you have your doubts, sir. This is understandable. Our little museum is rather unconventional after all. However, I promise that all your questions will be answered during the tour. Now, would you care to accompany me to the elevator? What? Now? I said with surprise. Don't I need to buy a ticket? And aren't there any other guests coming? The curator smiled thinly while shaking his head. We don't charge an admission fee, and I prefer to give one-on-one tours. Much more personal, don't you think? Now, shall we? At that, he turned his back on me and started walking towards the gas station forecourt. I had a decision to make in that moment. I could either turn heels and run back to my car, or I could follow this mysterious man and see where he would lead me. I know what I should have done, but I still felt drawn to the mystery. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing, and I let it get the better of me on that day. I followed him past the disused gas pumps and into the smashed-up forecourt, almost tripping over the trash and assorted debris. This wasn't like the entrance to any museum I'd ever visited before. What drew my attention, however, was the elevator door located at the rear end of the decrepit building. It looked like it had been newly installed at considerable expense. Stainless steel with a digital floor display and buttons lit up and ready to push. The curator summoned the elevator, and I watched as the doors slid open. After you, sir, the curator said while gesturing towards the waiting lift. I hesitated for just a second before stepping forward, feeling more than a little uneasy as the curator followed me inside and the door slammed shut. I don't know how far the elevator descended into the guts of the earth, but it seemed like we were going down for an eternity. Throughout the descent, the curator stood perfectly still, his smile gone as he glared straight at me with deadpan eyes. I felt nervous in that moment, as I feared the curator would lash out with the intention of doing me physical harm. I thought I might need to defend myself, but he never moved a muscle. I felt relief when the elevator finally reached the lower floor and the doors opened with a ping. But, of course, I had no idea what lay before me. We exited the lift, and the curator led me down a long, concrete corridor. I realized how exposed I really was down there, as my heart beat faster and I began to sweat heavily. What is this place? I asked nervously. The curator answered without turning to face me. A former government installation that we acquired for our purposes. A government installation? I had images of a former missile silo or fallout shelter. This only added to the mystery and my apprehension. Finally, we reached the end of the corridor and found a security door blocking our path. The curator typed a code into the keypad, opening it and inviting me inside. When I stepped through those doors, I couldn't believe what I saw. A vast subterranean chamber, its ceiling at least 60 feet high and with a length of about 2 football fields. The vast bunker was filled with military hardware and weapons, big screens displaying footage, and so many exhibits behind perspex glass. It was a literal treasure trove of military history, making for one of the most impressive museums I'd ever seen. The only thing missing was a gift shop. I was truly astonished by what I saw before me as I walked forward in a state of awestruck wonder, only for the curator to stop me in my tracks, as he placed an ice-cold hand on my shoulder and whispered in my ear, Please, sir, I must insist that we stick to the official tour. I don't understand, I responded. How did you get all this hardware? All will be revealed, sir. You just need to be patient. Now, shall we begin? I nodded my head and submitted to his wishes. He led me to the first exhibit, the sign above the cordoned-off section reading, "The Beginning." The curator began to speak in an authoritative tone of voice. What is war if not an act of conquest? And conquest is merely the exploitation of weakness. The time before the final war was one of decay, both moral and physical. Human civilization had reached its nadir during the first half of the 21st century, an inevitable result of corruption, conflict, terrorism, pandemics, greed, and environmental destruction. All this meant the time was ripe for the enemies of humanity to make their move. The enemies of humanity? This expression puzzled me, but I stayed silent for the time being, hoping to find out more. And of course, we played our role in promoting chaos, using fifth columnists to spread fear and hatred. He motioned me towards a big screen, which suddenly burst to life. The screen displayed CCTV footage of an office complex divided into cubicles, with workers sitting and staring at monitors. A second later, a lone gunman armed with an assault rifle burst into the building, firing without mercy at the unarmed workers, hunting them through the complex while reloading, slaughtering at least a dozen people before moving off screen, leaving blood and corpses on the floor behind him. The next piece of footage showed a man in a heavy coat entering what looked like a place of worship, with parishioners kneeling in prayer along the pews. The man walked halfway up the aisle before he was noticed, suddenly discarding his heavy coat to reveal a bomb strapped to his chest. Before anyone could react, he detonated the device, and the camera feed was replaced by static. I found the footage of these terror attacks overly graphic and distasteful, but made no comment. Beside the video display were various exhibits behind glass, including an AR-15 assault rifle and a suicide bomber's vest, along with details of numerous other attacks, as well as various schemes to promote political division and manipulate financial markets. When I'd finished reviewing the exhibits and material, the curator led me to the next section of the museum, entitled The First Strike. No doubt you've heard of the four horsemen of the apocalypse: conquest, war, famine, and death. Well, horsemen are a bit old-fashioned for this modern age, and so, instead, we recruited 4 pilots, sleeper agents, trusted and respected after long and illustrious careers, the last people who would be suspected. When activated, our pilots took control of 4 flights, simultaneously coordinating 2 mid-air collisions, killing hundreds and spreading fear and confusion throughout the world. He switched on a video of news footage showing explosions in the sky and debris falling to the earth. I racked my brains but couldn't recall such a terror attack, although I noted there were similarities to the September 11th atrocity. It's a terrible thing, I said, but we've seen terror attacks like this before. How is this one any worse? The curator nodded his head, smiling ever so slightly as he answered. What mattered is not the number of casualties, but the people who died. One of the planes carried the Secretary General of the UN, the second held the wealthiest tech billionaire in the world, the third transported the head of the Roman Church, and the fourth? That was Air Force One, killing the US President and most of his senior staff. I see, I replied, barely suppressing a smirk. I reckoned I would have remembered if the President and the Pope had been killed by terrorists on the same day. Obviously, this was all fake, but why would anyone go to such efforts? I thought about it for a moment, noting the great cost which must have gone into converting this space and the high production values of the news footage and the videos displayed. I reckoned a big Hollywood studio must be involved, and perhaps all this was to promote a new blockbuster movie. Maybe they were filming me right now, waiting to see my reaction. This was the only logical explanation I could think of, and so I decided to play along and see what happened. The curator talked me through the rest of the exhibit, which included debris from the downed planes and profiles of the victims, and then he moved on to the next area, entitled Shock and Awe. The end of the world begins in a suitably climactic fashion, the curator continued, with seemingly natural disasters of unprecedented ferocity. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, thousands will die in a few short hours. But this is only the beginning. He motioned me towards a screen, showing footage of devastated city streets, mass floods washing away acres of farmland, and lines of thousands of refugees fleeing from disaster areas. Next, the news showed aerial shots of huge and deep sinkholes, dozens of them spread across fault lines on each and every continent. The newsreaders explained how each hole was hundreds of feet wide and of unknown depth, and all the experts interviewed were baffled by their sudden appearance. As I watched the footage, the curator whispered in my ear, offering an explanation with just 2 chilling words: Hell's Mouth. The next screen showed what appeared to be satellite footage of one of the sinkholes. I was astonished to see dozens and then hundreds of what I could only describe as balls of fire emerging from the holes and firing in every direction. A wall of flame unlike anything I'd ever witnessed before. A narrator spoke over the footage in a monotone voice, explaining how each fireball was the size of an automobile and how they appeared to be guided by an unknown power, each with its own specific target. There are 1,000 sinkholes across the globe, the curator added, and thousands of fireballs emerge from each one, meaning millions of coordinated strikes upon every nation-state on the planet. More clips followed, and it became clear that the fireballs were virtually unstoppable. In one scene, a surface-to-air missile was fired, but simply passed through the flaming orb, not even diverting it from its course. The next clip showed a squadron of F-22 Raptors flying in formation, all suddenly being struck in mid-air, blown to smithereens before either their pilots or automated defense system could react. The footage switched to iconic buildings across the world: the White House, Pentagon, Westminster, the Kremlin, and the Great Hall of the People, to name but a few. They were all in flames, burning to the ground after multiple strikes. I had to admit that it looked very realistic, even if the destruction of famous landmarks is something of a disaster movie cliché. Alongside the big screens, there were a number of props on display, including the charred remains of the Resolute desk, normally found in the Oval Office. The shock and awe offensive was a success, the curator continued, crippling global governments and military commands. The scene is set for the commencement of the ground campaign. He then led me to the next exhibit, simply called Invasion. This was the largest section of the museum so far, and what I saw in there really shook me to my very core. A projection on a big screen showed a series of shocking images of carnage and death. The first showed a massive aircraft carrier on the open sea. The warship appeared to be sailing in calm seas. That was until the water around it began bubbling as if it was boiling. A huge shadow appeared under the surface, the type which could only have been cast by a sea creature of unbelievable size. The Leviathan did not surface, but instead extended its 8 enormous tentacles, each being 40 to 50 feet thick. The tentacles tightened their deadly grip around the body of the vast warship, using immense strength to pull it downwards into the water. I watched in awestruck horror as the aircraft carrier was turned on its side, throwing planes and helpless sailors into the boiling waters below. Next was an aerial shot of a beach, suddenly assaulted by huge serpent-like creatures that emerged from the waves, slithering across the sands towards a waiting line of soldiers and police who attempted to mount a defense to little effect. They fired upon the snakes with rifles and pistols, but the serpents kept on coming. In a moment, they were on top of the defenders, literally devouring the men by swallowing them whole. With the defenses defeated, the monsters were free to attack the city beyond. The curator had remained silent for several minutes, letting the footage speak for itself, although he did offer a short commentary before the next scene. Our offensive was assisted by local allies, although many of them were not exactly willing participants. To emphasize the point, I watched a film of an open plaza, which I recognized as being Tiananmen Square in Beijing. A company of Chinese troops had set up a defensive perimeter only to be assaulted by thousands of citizens in a zombified state, screaming bloody murder as they literally threw themselves at the line of heavily armored soldiers. The troops opened fire with every weapon in their arsenal, slaughtering hundreds in a matter of minutes, but the horde kept on coming, with zombies climbing over the corpses of their comrades to reach their objective. Soon, the horde overwhelmed the soldiers, literally ripping the troops to pieces and soiling the plaza with their blood and guts. It was horrific, but there was worse to come. The next shot showed the helmet cams of soldiers moving through a forested area in the dark, using night vision to survey their surroundings. I heard them speak with one another through their headsets. They all had British accents, making me think they must be UK Special Forces, most likely from the SAS. The atmosphere was tense, and it seemed like the troops were expecting an attack or ambush at any moment. Suddenly, there was a rapid burst of movement on the path ahead, as a creature leapt upon the lead soldier before he was able to react, dragging his body into the underbrush. The man's screams were still audible as the commander gave the order to open fire, and the screen was filled with tracer bullets and the chaos of battle. More attacks followed, with soldiers being sliced to pieces or dragged into the tree line by creatures that moved so quickly they were impossible to take down. And then, the soldiers with the helmet cam looked up, seeing a monster perched on a tree directly above his head. He illuminated the creature with a torch mounted on his gun, revealing what I can only describe as a werewolf, its teeth and claws razor sharp and its eyes burning a demonic red. The soldier pulled the trigger a split second after the werewolf leapt from the tree, but it was already too late. The monster tore into him, ripping and shredding his flesh in a violent frenzy. The man screamed before his camera feed cut out. The final scene in the reel was the most shocking. The camera view showed a city street somewhere in the US, a city transformed into a war zone. A party of American troops had set up a roadblock and were facing an enemy as yet unseen. The ground shook, indicating that something huge and powerful was making its way down the street. And a moment later, it came into view. A huge demon, easily 50 to 60 feet tall. It had the head of a bull, with horns and a snout filled with enormous teeth, and eyes burning as red as the sun. And its mighty legs like those of a goat, complete with cloven hooves that cracked the tarmac as the monstrosity marched along the suburban street. The soldiers opened fire with assault rifles and a machine gun mounted on top of an armored Humvee, but their bullets had no effect, merely bouncing off the beast's body as if its hide was made of steel. Suddenly, a projectile was fired from somewhere off-screen, probably a shoulder-mounted missile or RPG. The projectile struck the demon in its torso, causing the beast to roar aloud in pain and anger. The monster reacted by pulling a weapon from its sheath, a sword made of fire and at least the length of 2 men. With one mighty sweep, it took out a dozen soldiers, literally cutting them in two, smearing the streets with their guts and internal organs. Men screamed as the demon used his sword to smash through the roof of a Humvee before it continued its thumping advance down the blood-strewn street. A moment later, 2 demons, both as large and strong as their leader, marched into the shot, finishing off any survivors with their swords or by crushing them underneath their hooves. There were many other scenes of brutal atrocities and monsters stalking the earth, but as hard-hitting as the footage had been, it was nothing compared to the exhibits located in this section of the museum. The footage directed me towards a group of dummy soldiers behind the glass, a dozen troops from different armies. American, Russian, Chinese, Indian, and others, all dressed in their national combat uniforms and with assault rifles pinned to their chests. It was only on closer inspection that I realized it wasn't plastic mannequins dressed up in uniforms, but rather mummified corpses. Dead men with discolored skin, their eyes removed and empty sockets staring out at me. The bodies were frighteningly realistic and totally grotesque. I looked to the curator for an explanation, but he merely shrugged his shoulders before answering. I would like to say they fought bravely, but the truth is, most of humanity's armies were crushed in a matter of days. I shook my head in disbelief, astonished at the lengths they'd gone to. Still mesmerized, I wandered through the rest of the exhibits as the curator patiently waited for me to finish. Above my head, hanging from the ceiling, was the fuselage of a F-35 Lightning jet. One of its wings had been shot off, but otherwise it was nearly intact. I looked to its smashed-up cockpit and noted that the charred remains of the pilot were still inside. Below the aircraft sat a Russian T-14 Armata tank, with a huge hole clearly visible through the top of its turret, making it look like a pierced tin can. There were many more vehicles and weapons on display, state-of-the-art military hardware which would have cost millions to manufacture and maintain, now reduced to useless pieces of junk. It was an extraordinary yet horrifying sight to behold, and I began to question the motives of whoever had set this all up. When I finished my review, the curator pointed me to another big screen and offered me further narrative.
The surviving remnants of Earth's political and military leaders hold themselves up in their bunkers during the final days. Desperate and out of options, they authorize nuclear strikes against our hell's mouths, hoping they could halt the invasion. But alas, they only succeeded in killing millions of their own people, whilst hastening the destruction of the planet. The screen showed footage of ICBM strikes, of nuclear detonations brighter than the sun, mushroom clouds ascending into the skies, and of devastated landscapes with entire cities reduced to ruins and rubble. A map came up which showed the locations of the nuclear strikes, dotted all across the globe. The results of these coordinated attacks would surely be catastrophic. The curator allowed me time to take it all in before leading me to the next and penultimate section, entitled The Spoils of War. With victory now assured, the time had come for my master to claim what is rightfully his, namely, the bodies and souls of the conquered. He led me through a grotesque display of severed human heads, somehow preserved and mounted upon spikes behind perspex glass, their dead eyes still open and staring out at me in an accusatory manner. The decapitated heads belonged to political, military, business, and religious leaders, several of whom I recognized from the news. The resemblance was uncanny, right down to the smallest of details. I walked past the macabre displays, finding the whole experience extremely unnerving. I saw the curator watching me as I proceeded through the grim exhibit. I noticed he was smiling, apparently taking pleasure in my discomfort and disgust. When I was finished, he directed me towards one final screen, allowing the images to speak for themselves. And the signage above read, "A world transitioned." The video showed clips of devastated and lifeless landscapes, the sun blocked out by a thick cloud of radioactive dust. Next came the image of a huge demon standing over a party of defeated prisoners, laughing cruelly as it used its fiery sword to slice the POWs into pieces. And finally, the horrifying footage of a line of emaciated refugees slowly marching across a dead land, men, women, and children, many showing the signs of advanced radiation poisoning, their skin badly burnt and bodies covered in cancerous tumors. They were totally defeated, their heads down as they trudged forward to an unknown destination. Several fell down to the mud, so weak that they couldn't go on, and their fellow refugees made no effort to help the victims, instead continuing with their own grim death march to nowhere. I felt physically sick after watching these horrific scenes, and it took me a moment to compose myself and come back to reality. Everything I'd seen, all he'd exposed me to, it all seemed so real, but I had to remind myself that it couldn't possibly be. I turned back to the curator, who stood silent by my side, meaning to challenge him and expose his sick charade. "Well, sir," I began, "this is quite the show you've put on today. Obviously, you've gone to some great lengths and expense, but I reckon it's time you told me the truth. What's the real story here? What's your agenda?" Honestly, sir, even after all you've seen and heard, you still don't believe?
"Well, of course I don't." I snorted in disbelief. "None of the events you've shown me have happened in the real world."
They haven't happened yet,
he replied coyly.
What you have seen is the future. This is humanity's destiny.
Ridiculous! Do you take me for a damn fool? The curator smiled, and I noted a malicious glint in his eye.
Well, sir, I can see you're the cynical type, but don't worry. We do have a special private exhibit for persons such as yourself, for those who require indisputable proof, if you care to follow me.
He led me to the far wall of the bunker, where another security door was located. He quickly typed in a code to open the door and reveal a darkened chamber within. With some trepidation, I walked forward into the darkness, noting the stench inside, which reminded me of a zoo or kennels. The darkness was all-encompassing and the silence deafening. That was until the curator turned on the lights and all hell broke loose. I was hit by a hellish conflation of sights and sounds so horrifying that I was forced to retreat, only to find the security door was shut, trapping me inside with these unspeakable horrors. When I eventually felt brave enough to turn around, I found myself face to face with a literal army of nightmares, monsters barely contained and mad as hell. The same as the ones on film, now locked behind a thick glass screen. It burnt as bright as the sun as it crashed against the walls of its prison, and when I examined the fiery orb in greater detail, I swore I could see a human face within the flames, a tormented soul trapped within. On the far side of the chamber was a bloodthirsty werewolf trapped in a cage, snarling and growling as it tried to get free, its red eyes burning with hatred as its claws and teeth tore at the metal bars. Beyond the wolf sat a huge water tank containing a green-scaled serpent at least 20 feet long, with fangs as long as steak knives. It frantically circled the tank, splashing murky water against the glass. The last, but certainly not least, was the monster held in chains and behind reinforced glass at the far end of the chamber, a demon so tall its horns almost touched the ceiling. The monstrosity was nearly identical to the ones I'd seen in the videos, nearly 60 feet tall with the head of a bull, body of a man, and cloven hooves of a goat. The demon roared as it struggled with its chains, its evil eyes focused upon me as it pulled with all its might. I cowered in the corner, terrified and fearing for my life, as I believed the monsters would break free and tear me to shreds at any moment. But the curator was in control of the creatures, and he was able to calm them with a mere click of his fingers, ending their frenzy and reducing the monsters to a docile state. I shook my head in disbelief, the cold sweat dripping from my forehead as I muttered my next words in a state of shock. It's all real.
Yes,
the curator replied firmly. When will it happen? I asked through shaking lips. The curator shrugged.
Whenever the conditions are right. It could be a year, it could be 5, but rest assured, it will happen soon.
I took a deep breath. A million things were racing through my mind in that moment, but there was one fear which immediately came to mind. You're not going to let me leave this place, are you? I asked nervously, because now I know the truth.
On the contrary, sir, the tour is now over and you are free to leave whenever you like.
I was confused and suspected a trap. But I know everything. Aren't you afraid I'll tell people what I've seen?
Tell whoever you want,
he answered with a dismissive shrug.
No one will believe you. The museum will not remain in this location, and you'll have no proof of what you saw here. At most, you'll contribute to the existing undercurrent of fear and paranoia, which will only assist in my master's plan.
I shook my head in disbelief, feeling faint as the monsters continued to stare me down. Surely you don't think you'll get away with this? I demanded.
Oh, I know we will,
he answered confidently, the glint in his eye turning into a look of pure evil.
Humanity's fate is already set in stone. The reign of fire is nigh. Now, if you'll be so kind, sir, the museum will soon be closing, and you really should be on your way.
The curator was as good as his word, as he escorted me to the waiting elevator and back to my car on the surface. I was allowed to leave unharmed. He was right about another thing, too. Nobody did believe my story. Not my friends, family, the other members of the forum, the cops, or even several priests I spoke with. They all thought I was crazy. The police did go out to the site, but they found no evidence of any underground chamber or elevator, and the enigmatic curator was nowhere to be seen. I've never found any solid proof to confirm my claims, but rumors persist online, with anonymous posters speaking of mysterious museums popping up in remote locations. Eastern Siberia, the Australian outback, and the mountains of Tibet have all been mentioned, but there's never anything definite. So I've come here to share my story, in the sincere hope that someone will believe me. The things I've seen, the horrors revealed to me, I just can't live with them. I don't believe humanity's fate is inevitable. We must fight back, whether it be by conventional means or with the help of a higher power. We must prepare and ultimately prevail against the forces of evil, because the alternative is too awful to contemplate. This is a story I promised to never tell. For years, I told myself it wasn't real, that I'd suffered from a paranoid delusion or mental breakdown on the day it happened. Even now, I still can't fully rule out a mental health episode during my youth, but in the 20 years since, I've never experienced anything like it, nor have I been able to determine any logical explanation for the bizarre and terrifying occurrences. So, unless I was secretly slipped some previously unknown psychedelic drug on the morning in question, I must conclude that my experience was real, and this is what terrifies me to my core, because as time goes on, I fear that the horrors I was exposed to back then will one day come to our world, and when that day comes, God help us all. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let me take you back to that fateful morning. I was a first-year history student attending a well-known university. I won't name my school here, but suffice to say, it's not notorious for paranormal occurrences or unexplained incidents. Sure, it's an old university with its fair share of urban legends and ghost stories, but nothing that really stands out. But tales of phantoms and ghouls were the last thing on my mind on that Wednesday morning. Like most first-year students, I did my fair share of partying, and I'd been out late on a Tuesday night, sleeping in and running late from my 9 a.m. lecture. I recall hastily throwing on some clothes and quickly brushing my teeth before grabbing my rucksack and sprinting out of my halls and across the street to the lecture hall. I was still in a daze, hungover and half asleep as I made the frantic dash across the concrete, panting and sweating, but barely taking in my surroundings. If I'd been more savvy, I might have realized something was wrong before I reached the lecture theater, but instead, I ran straight into a trap. There was a moment, however, when I felt something wasn't right. It came just as I ascended the stairs and prepared to push open the lecture room door. It was like some kind of sixth sense, a primal fear buried deep in my subconscious, or perhaps my soul itself. I experienced a literal chill down my spine, freezing momentarily with my hand on the ice-cold door handle. It was like there was a voice screaming inside of my head, telling me that I shouldn't go inside. I should have listened to my instincts, but I was young and foolish, telling myself this was stupid and I had nothing to fear. And so I pushed the door open and entered, making a decision that I'll regret for the rest of my life. At first glance, the interior of the lecture hall didn't look anything out of the ordinary, as I observed rows of seats set up in an amphitheater style, facing down towards the podium where the lecturer stood over a projector screen showing a PowerPoint presentation. Rows of students sat in tight formation, all sitting in total silence with their eyes facing front. It was eerie how quiet it was inside that theater. You literally could have heard a pin drop. This was my second indication that something was off about this classroom. Usually you could guarantee some chatter from the back seats, with somebody messing around or slacking off, but not with this class. They were the most well-behaved and focused students I'd ever encountered. And this wasn't all. There must have been close to 100 students inside that lecture theater, and they were all dressed identically. Now, even 20 years ago, you'd expect to see some diversity amongst young people attending university. This is the time for experimentation, after all, for trying out new styles and fashions and breaking the mold, but this lot clearly hadn't gotten the message. Each and every one was dressed in a dark black uniform, shirts and trousers for the boys, blouses and long skirts for the girls. Not only that, but they all had the same hair, the boys with short crew cuts and girls with hair tied back into neat buns. None of the females wore makeup from what I could tell. And clearly, I was the last student to arrive for the lecture, and I felt very uncomfortable as I walked down the aisle in search of a seat. But no one turned to look at me or even acknowledge my existence. They all kept their eyes on the front podium, their faces emotionless and devoid of expression. This was freaky enough, but then I saw the lecturer. On the surface, our teacher seemed quite normal. A middle-aged academic type, dressed in a tweed suit and sporting a well-trimmed goatee beard. He wore reading glasses, which he lowered ever so slightly as he watched me approach. Alarm bells were ringing inside my head as I looked into his dark eyes and observed a barely suppressed malice. I'd never met this man before, but could tell straight away that he hated me. I had no idea why. I was so taken aback by his hateful glare that I simply stood there in the aisle, frozen by a terror I could not explain. And then he opened his mouth to speak. His voice was deep, piercing, and almost inhuman.
Good morning. Nice of you to join us.
Such a comment wasn't unexpected, but his tone was more accusatory than sarcastic. I physically shook as I struggled to find the words to respond. I'm sorry I'm late, I eventually stuttered.
Well, make sure it doesn't happen again or you will regret it.
That was a threat, pure and simple. I had no doubt that this man would punish me for any slight indiscretion.
Now, take a seat so we can get started.
I did so without hesitation, practically jumping into a chair located on an empty row, 3 from the front. I glanced over my shoulder only briefly, looking above the heads of the student clones and back to the door. I realized then that I should have listened to my instincts and walked away, but it was too late. There was no way I could slip away now, not with the lecturer's cutting glare upon me. I was here for the duration, but I couldn't have imagined what this fiend would expose to me over the next hour.
Now, before we begin today's class, I have some housekeeping to deal with. First off, health and safety. The university authorities have asked me to remind you all that there are no emergency exits in this building. So, in the case of a fire, you're all going to fry.
This struck me as a joke in very poor taste, but the lecturer kept a straight face, and there wasn't even a snicker from the assembled students.
And your essay assignments are due on Friday. The penalty for late submission is 20 lashes from the Cat of Nine Tails. No exceptions.
What the? I thought, but didn't say. 20 lashes? Was this psycho really advocating corporal punishment? I couldn't even believe what I was hearing, but the weirdest part was still to come.
Right. Let's pick up where we left off last week. Our topic, the Final War, 1939 to 42.
He clicked the remote control device in his hand to show the first slide in the presentation, which repeated the course title, displaying the words using a black Gothic font against a blood-red background. I had to think for a second before I realized the obvious problem with the course title. The lecture I was meant to be attending this morning was on the Second World War, and of course this global conflict lasted from 1939 to 45. What's more, I've never heard of this period referred to as the Final War, a title which would be factually incorrect for obvious reasons. My confusion grew as the creepy lecturer presented the next slide. This included an old black and white photograph of a ruined city. I noted how every building was reduced to rubble and saw the crater-like hole which swallowed up the debris. This did not look like a crater caused by a bomb or artillery shells, but rather a deep, gaping opening in the ground which had no logical explanation. The text above the grim image was equally disturbing, as it read, 1942, the year hell rose up. I was still pondering the meaning of all of this when the lecturer moved on to the next slide and began his explanatory narrative. The image on screen was familiar to me, a map of Europe circa the autumn of 1942, when the Nazi Empire was at its greatest extent. stretching from France in the west to the Volga in the east, and Norway in the north to the Sahara in the south. The next map showed Japanese conquests in the Far East, extending across China, Southeast Asia, and most of the Western Pacific Rim. This was the point of the war where the Axis powers seemed to be on the verge of victory as their militaries conquered and occupied vast swaths of territory and oppressed millions of people. But, of course, the Allied powers were mustering their forces and preparing counterattacks across multiple fronts, mobilizing vast armies and resources to achieve a total victory by 1945. But this lecturer had a very different story to tell.
The course of the war to date had gone reasonably well from our perspective. The Nazi juggernaut had swept across Europe, toppling nations, destroying armies, and slaughtering countless innocents. Disciples of chaos, violence, and bloodshed. Perhaps the best we've seen throughout human history. Yes, the fascists proudly bore the mark of Cain, but they weren't the only ones. The godless Soviets were quite happy to starve and shoot millions in pursuit of their workers' paradise. The Japanese conquered and enslaved their fellow Asians, and even the liberty-loving British and Americans could justify bombing cities into the ground. Yes, evil was flourishing, and violence had become normalized on the mortal plane. Mankind had created this bloodbath, and they unwittingly presented us with the perfect opportunity to rise up and launch our own assault upon the earth.
I visibly shook when I heard those words. What I was hearing made no sense whatsoever. It was farcical, and I wondered whether this was all some kind of elaborate practical joke. But deep down, I didn't believe this was the case. Everything I'd seen and heard seemed so real. I'd never been a great believer in the paranormal or spiritual world, nor was I a particular fan of science fiction. I couldn't fathom the idea that I'd somehow been transported to a different dimension or plane of existence, but my instincts told me I was in mortal danger. My panicked brain tried to formulate a plan, but all I could think to do was sit quietly and wait for the opportunity to get out. And in the meantime, I would listen to the lecturer's bizarre and disturbing alternate history of World War II. The next slide was a more detailed map of the Caucasus region of southern Russia, centered around the city of Stalingrad, a scene of perhaps the most famous battle of the entire war.
A city named for one despot and craved by another. Stalingrad was the scene of some of the most brutal violence in human history, savage urban warfare between two vast war machines. The streets ran with blood, and the carnage provided the ideal launchpad for our invasion of the surface world.
I gulped, wondering what he was talking about. I couldn't have predicted what happened next, not in my worst nightmares. The next slide was source material, an extract from the diary of Sergeant Viktor Petrov of the 34th Guards Rifle Division, stationed on the Stalingrad front, and dated the 1st, November 1942. The lecturer instructed us to study the translated account carefully, which I did. Not only that, but I copied the exact text down onto my notepad and kept it to this very day. It reads, "The fascist dogs have bombarded our positions throughout the day, mercilessly attacking our remaining positions on the west bank of the river. Their stormtroopers push forward slowly, but we fight for every inch of territory, street by street, house by house. Our casualties are heavy, but morale remains high. We have heard rumors of a planned counteroffensive with troops amassing on the east bank. If we can only hold the fascists back for a few more weeks, we will turn this battle around." At this point, there was a gap in the transcription. When it continued, the tone of the account changed significantly. I thought I had seen hell, but I was wrong. The horrors of this battle were only a prelude to an evil beyond belief. It started at midnight. The shooting and artillery stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. A moment later, the ground shook with an unprecedented ferocity, an earthquake which brought the already ruined buildings toppling down on our positions. In the chaos that followed, I noticed something horrific and inexplainable. The river Volga was boiling, waters warmed to an impossible heat, despite the bitter cold in the air. My comrades and I could only watch in shocked awe as the ground before us opened up, revealing a vast, gaping hole descending deep into the earth. That was the moment when I noticed a change in my comrades. Brave men who'd fought tooth and nail against the fascists suddenly broke down sobbing, praying to a god we were told didn't exist. The doctrines of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin could not explain this event. Socialism has no answers for the evils we are witnessing. The fire came first, each the size of an automobile and burning with fiery intensity as bright as the sun. There must have been thousands of these fireballs, all rising into the dark sky above. Some fell on our positions, causing huge explosions which destroyed vehicles and men, resulting in utter carnage. We saw how these fiery orbs also hit the fascist lines, dispensing any last doubt that this could be a new weapon deployed by the Germans. Soon the entire city was ablaze, but many more orbs ascended from the depths, heading beyond city's borders and flying north, south, west, and east. I guess they were targeting other positions far from here, and they seemed to be guided by some unseen force. The ground attack commenced shortly before dawn. They came in droves, thousands of bloodthirsty killers throwing themselves at our lines in wave after wave of mindless suicide attacks. We rallied our comrades and fought back with everything we could muster, hitting the new enemy with rifle, machine gun, and artillery fire. We must have taken down thousands, but they kept on coming until our ammunition was almost exhausted. By the time the attackers reached our lines, we made a horrifying discovery. The enemy soldiers had once been people like us, but they were no longer human. The best way I can describe them as is undead, zombie-like legions whose rotting corpses have been brought back to life, their bodies controlled by some kind of evil presence. We saw how some still wore the tattered uniforms of our army and that of our Nazi enemies. The dead are literally waging war against us. The political commissars were the first to break, abandoning their positions and fleeing like the cowards they are. My comrades fought bravely, engaging the enemy hand by hand after we ran out of bullets, but the outcome was inevitable. There were too many of them and our assault was relentless. I was one of the few who escaped the slaughter, watching on in horror as those damn ghouls ripped my comrades to pieces and feasted on their still warm flesh. I can still hear the screams from my current position as I cower in a basement beside a squad of SS soldiers, my former enemies, now unlikely allies against this hellish legion. I don't expect to survive this day. And that's where the transcript abruptly ended. I could hardly focus on the lecturer's words as he continued the class, and I tried to comprehend what I just read. I told myself that it couldn't be real, but photographic evidence soon followed. The first image displayed on the PowerPoint showed a night sky lit up by thousands of burning orbs, just like the witness had described. The next was a graphic image of savagery and bloodshed. The photographer appeared to be on the roof of a building overlooking the blood-splattered city square overrun by zombie-like foot soldiers who feasted upon the entrails of dead and dying soldiers, both Soviet and German. Last came a grainy black and white image of something truly terrifying. A vast gargoyle-like creature perched on top of a ruined building, its wings folded. I noted its evil scowl exposing rows of dagger-like teeth and the blackness in its eyes, like those of a shark. Seeing those foul images only added to my anxiety, but somehow I was able to compose myself enough to keep listening, and the twisted professor continued his lecture.
The hellmouth that we opened beneath Stalingrad was the first, but many more followed over the days to come. Our forces launched coordinated attacks on every front across Europe, Asia, and North Africa, and indeed we opened new fronts far from the previous conflict zone. The Americas, Australia, India, no nation or colony would escape our glorious onslaught.
To confirm his point, the lecturer clicked onto the next slide. A map of the world showing the location of multiple hellmouths as he described them, located across each and every continent. Given what I'd seen and heard about the assault upon Stalingrad, I could only imagine the horrific impact of these multiple invasions on a world already torn apart by war. But there was worse to come. The next slide included a hyperlink to an audio file, which the lecturer promptly played over the speakers. The clip was a news broadcast by BBC Radio in London, dated the 7th of November, 1942. The newsreader's name was unknown.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is today's news. I am reporting from our nation's capital, a city in flames. We have lived through the relentless German bombing during the dark days of 1940, But this latest campaign of wanton destruction is at least 10 times more severe. For the past 72 hours, our great capital has been subjected to a constant bombardment by fiery orbs, all of which appear to have ascended from the so-called Hellmouth located in central France. The devastation and carnage is unprecedented, with hardly a district of London remaining untouched by this indiscriminate attack. Reports are sketchy, but it appears that all our major landmarks have been hit and are now in flames. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Houses of Parliament, Tower Bridge. Generations of our history and heritage destroyed, engulfed by an unholy fire. Our brave airmen and ground defense teams have fought frantically against the onslaught, but it seems they are almost powerless against this hellish force. The ground assault began at dawn yesterday morning and was similar in nature to what we've seen on the continent and in Russia. Mindless, zombie-like hordes have taken to the streets, attacking soldiers and civilians alike in a merciless, bloody frenzy. Casualty numbers are unknown, but are certainly in the thousands.
The newsreader paused for a moment. When he spoke again, a raw emotion was evident in his previously monotone and clipped voice.
The whereabouts of the royal family and the government are unknown. We are unable to confirm reports that the Prime Minister perished whilst personally leading the defense of Downing Street. There are rumors of attacks across the country by all manner of vicious beasts. Giant serpents emerging from the English Channel, savage wolfmen stalking the Scottish countryside. We have little to no information about the situation overseas. All contact has been lost with Cape Town, Calcutta, Sydney, and Toronto. Barely a corner of the Empire has escaped this fiendish assault.
At this point, the newsreader's transmission abruptly ended and was followed by a few seconds of static before a new voice took over the broadcast. The speaker's tone was deep, chilling, and barely human.
He has risen. The Dark Lord has arrived on the mortal plane, and his legions are conquering the earth in his name. Nothing can stop our onslaught. Those who wish to survive must join us. We require a service to our master. Follow these instructions carefully. Take a knife or sharp instrument and use it. You must kill a family member or neighbor. Slice open their belly and feed on what's inside. This must be done. Evil shall prevail.
The broadcast ended there. I felt physically sick, hardly able to breathe as the horrific meaning behind these words hit home. I couldn't imagine the sheer terror experienced by those forced to listen to that evil broadcast. The professor calmly continued his lecture, not missing a beat.
As our reign of terror stalked the land, a simultaneous campaign commenced on the high seas.
The next slide was a written transcript by Chief Warrant Officer Patrick Riley, stationed on the destroyer USS Strong, and dated the 12th of November, 1942. We've been hunting the Japanese submarine for 3 days in the waters of New Guinea. They sunk 3 American ships already and killed a lot of my friends, so we took the hunt personally. Our ship had been at sea for almost 2 months, and so we had little idea of what was happening back home. We heard reports of attacks on the US mainland, but reckoned it was a new Axis offensive, so this made us all the more determined to strike back. The enemy captain was good because he'd evaded us for days, disappearing without a trace after torpedo attacks on our ships. That's why we were astonished when the sub suddenly surfaced in broad daylight, only about half a mile from our starboard side. The enemy boat was literally a sitting duck, but the order came down to hold fire. We thought they might have experienced mechanical difficulties and wanted to surrender, but this wasn't the case. I used my binoculars to observe the enemy boat, watching as the topside hatch popped open and a Japanese officer emerged. I saw the sheer panic in his face as he waved frantically in my direction. At the time, we had no idea what he was doing, but I guess he was trying to warn us, because within a minute, all hell broke loose. The first thing I noticed was the water around the sub boiling, as if the sea was suddenly heated to an impossibly high temperature. To my horror, I saw a vast dark shadow under the surface, as something huge ascended from the depths. Next, tentacles emerged from beneath the waves, vast appendages as thick as tree trunks. The slimy tentacles wrapped around the exposed body of the submarine, tightening their grip so hard that they crushed the steel hull. The beast seemed to exert little effort as it pulled the boat under the waves, condemning its crew to a watery grave. Never in all my years on the sea had I ever witnessed something so horrific, nor had I ever imagined such a creature could exist anywhere in our world. Our crew nearly descended into a blind panic after witnessing the devastating attack. There was a brief debate amongst the officers as to whether we should open fire on the beast or flee from the scene. We chose the latter. I doubt our guns could have inflicted much damage on a monster of such immense size. We sailed north at top knots, but didn't make it far. The beast covered the distance in a remarkably short time, and we were horrified to see its huge tentacles ascending, each with multiple suckers the size of a man's head. The monster wrapped itself around our ship's hull, slowly pulling our boat down below the surface. At this point, discipline completely broke down as men cried and screamed and did whatever they could to escape the sinking ship. I was thrown overboard in the scramble, falling into the boiling water below, screaming as my skin was badly burnt. As my frail body sank below the surface, I saw the beast's huge, gaping maw, a beak-like mouth big enough to swallow our ship whole. When I stared into its open jaws, I saw a dark abyss, a blackness I feared could swallow up the entire world. I didn't want to fall into those jaws, so I fought with all my strength, kicking my way back to the surface. There I found only chaos and anarchy. As our boat was pulled under, the few survivors swam for their lives. I don't know how I made it out, but somehow I grabbed hold of a piece of floating debris and escaped the deadly whirlpool, floating across the open water until I reached a coral reef a few miles to the south. I lay there half dead for 2 days before a U.S. plane spotted me and I was rescued. I was the only survivor from the Strong's crew. They told me how lucky I was, but I'm not sure that's true, given the hell I came back to. I later learned that the Leviathan, which sank our ship, was only one of many spread across the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, attacking Allied, Axis, and neutral ships alike and covering huge distances within a short space of time. It wasn't long before these monsters shut down virtually all shipping routes across the high seas, making the transportation of food, weapons, and people nearly impossible. The accompanying photograph on the next slide showed an American aircraft carrier being attacked by one of those leviathans, its vast tentacles wrapping around its hull as planes and sailors fell helplessly into the hot waters. I shook my head in disbelief, trying to imagine the sheer terror those men must have experienced when they were attacked by this huge monster from the depths. The next slide was a global map similar to the one previously displayed and showing the location of the Hellmouths. This map also showed the invasion's progress, with huge areas of land marked in red, meaning they were now under the control of Hell's legions.
The initial stages of our invasion went as planned, with the armies of humanity quickly falling victim to our lightning offensive. But pockets of resistance remained, holdouts too stubborn to accept the inevitable, or perhaps hoping for divine intervention. We needed to remove this hope, to show the scattered remnants of humanity that their struggle was futile. This is when we deployed our elite divisions.
He presented another written source, this one being an account of Private First Class Jerry Langdon of the Indiana National Guard, dated the 30th of November, 1942. They told us we'd be shipped out to the Pacific or Europe, but instead we're fighting in our own backyard against an enemy so evil that we can hardly believe they exist. These monsters are like something from our worst nightmare, but their invasion is all too real. Our battalion was deployed just outside of Gary, and about 500 miles north of the Midwestern Hellmouth. The fiendish hordes were rapidly advancing upon our positions, and we knew that we were one of the last units standing between the enemy and Chicago. We'd already cut our teeth fighting against the ghouls, the undead that swamped our lines with their suicidal attacks. Their assaults are relentless, and we lost almost half our men, but somehow we'd held the line. We expected more of the same, but as brave as our boys were, we had no answer for what came next. The attack came at dawn, an icy blizzard that battered our positions throughout the night, but we were awoken by the ground shaking as something huge smashed through the cornfields south of our position. We heard the giant crashes and we froze in terror, dreading whatever hellish monstrosity they were sending against us. The creature which emerged from the storm front was hideous, a minotaur-like beast with the horned head of a bull, the body of a man adorned with armor, and hooves which smashed into the ground. The demon, and I'm sure that's what it was, must have been over 50 feet tall, its massive frame dominating the skyline. To my horror, I saw how its hateful eyes burned to crimson red. It opened its mouth to reveal razor-sharp teeth and let out a powerful, animalistic roar which chilled me to my bones. The demon was armed with a flaming sword, easily the length of 3 grown men, and it moved quickly, the ground shaking with every step. The beast was soon joined by 2 others, both of comparable size and strength. One was similarly armed with a giant flaming sword, while the third carried what appeared to be a crossbow. The hellish trio were still about a mile away from our position when the third demon raised its weapon and fired a huge bolt of fire that tore across the gap, directly hitting the Sherman tank to our rear. The resulting explosion reduced the vehicle to a flaming wreck. At that moment, the first demon roared and charged, while the third reloaded. We threw everything we had at the enemy, firing rifles, machine guns, and bazookas. We must have hit them with hundreds of rounds, but our bullets and shells had little impact, as nothing we did could penetrate their thick armor. The beasts attacked us with a hateful glee, using their flaming swords to slice our boys to shreds. I saw a squad of men cut in half by a single swing of a sword, staining the ground with blood and guts. There was no way we could resist such a devastating assault, and so our defensive line soon fell short. As I write this, I am hiding in an abandoned barn with a handful of fellow survivors. We can hear the demons stomping around in the surrounding fields, roaring in triumph as they pick off our people one by one. I do not expect to survive much longer. I'm writing this in hopes that my words make it back to my wife and children. I want them to know that I'm sorry. We tried everything to stop this evil, but their power is too great. I love you all, and pray we'll meet again in a better place. The soldier's final words nearly brought me to tears, but what I saw next was truly terrifying. A grainy black and white film appeared on the projector screen, showing a cornfield and a wooden barn, presumably somewhere in the American Midwest. The ground beneath the cameraman's feet shook, making it difficult for him to hold the camera steady. Then the demon came into shot, its huge frame dominating the skyline. The horned beast was almost twice the height of the barn. I noticed how the thick steel armor it wore was marked with dents, presumably caused by bullets, but the beast did not appear to be wounded. The demon moved slowly but with purpose, appearing to sniff the air as it carefully surveyed its surroundings. The beast reached out with its mighty clawed hands, tearing the roof off the barn and reaching inside. To my horror, I watched it picking up a screaming figure, a woman by the looks of it. It sneered with an evil look in its eyes and crushed the woman's body in its fist before ripping her in 2 pieces and casually tossing her remains into the cornfield. Then the film ended. I barely had a moment to breathe before the next horrifying film began. This one appeared to be taken from the cone of a fighter jet. As it strafed enemy forces on the ground, it came in low, firing its twin machine guns at the huge frame of yet another giant demon. The beast roared with rage as it looked up, swinging its sword at the plane which had flown in too close. It struck the aircraft like a cat would strike at a pigeon, cutting through it with fire and abruptly bringing the footage to a brutal end. We returned to the world map, and I noticed how the red, or occupied areas, now took up most of the global landmass, with only a few isolated pockets not under Hell's control. The world's great cities, London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, they were all marked with a death skull, indicating that they had been neutralized. Meanwhile, the sneering lecturer continued his account with a cold, emotionless tone.
Victory for our forces was within reach, but one holdout remained, here.
He used the laser pointer to highlight Berlin on the map, which I noted was one of the few remaining cities not marked with an ominous skull.
This is where humanity made their desperate last stand.
Another transcript followed, this time from the diary of Hauptmann Heinrich Müller of Wehrmacht's 163rd Infantry Division, dated the 19th December 1942. Today, the shattered remnants of my division arrive in what they're calling Fortress Berlin. The generals have told us this is where we will break the fiendish invaders, but few of us believe this is possible. We will surely die in this city, but at least we'll die fighting. Berlin is already a graveyard, having been subjected to a constant bombardment of their damned fireballs, but we have learned some lessons from the disaster at Stalingrad, using the ruined buildings to our advantage as we engage the enemy in urban warfare. Perhaps we will hold them back, for a time at least. Our forces are quite the mixed bunch, consisting of battered Wehrmacht units, the remnants of the Red Army, and a scattering of French and Poles. Air support is being provided by the few planes the Luftwaffe and RAF have left. We even have some freed Jewish prisoners fighting as auxiliaries, and the price we paid for this tenuous coalition? Deposing Hitler and his Nazi cronies. They're all dead now, replaced by a junta of Prussian generals who rule over what little remains of the German Reich. We are anticipating simultaneous attacks from both the west and east, and our recon planes have reported huge forces amassing on the city's borders. We can deal with the zombie hordes as long as our ammunition supplies hold out. The giant demons are a far more serious foe, however. The generals tell us they can be killed by concentrated artillery bombardment or aerial bombing. Time will tell whether this is true. The weather is bitterly cold, and the tension and fear inside the city is palpable. Every day we lose more people, soldiers and civilians both. Many die from exposure or starvation, while others have committed suicide, and some have gone over to the other side. One of our patrols called into an apartment block last night after reports of a disturbance. They entered a family home to find a horrific scene. The mother and 3 children were laid out across the floor, their throats slit from ear to ear and their bellies cut open, exposing their innards in a sickening display. The father still had the butcher's knife in his hand. His mouth dripped with blood and there was a crazed look in his eyes, like he stared into the abyss for too long, the darkness having driven him insane. He charged at our men with the knife raised, unleashing a hellish wail as he came. 2 soldiers pumped him full of bullets with their MP40s, hitting him with almost 60 rounds before he finally stopped breathing. Sadly, incidents like this have become commonplace. We have heard little from the rest of the world. The support we hoped to receive from the Americans has not been forthcoming, and the reports we've received say the entire east coast of the US is ablaze. The few survivors who make it out of the enemy-held territory describe scenes of unspeakable cruelty and a biblical-scale slaughter. Perhaps our ramshackle army is the last significant resistance to Hell's invasion. We stand ready to fight as humanity's final hope. The next excerpt was dated the 23rd of December, 1942. I transcribed it as follows. The attack began at dusk as thousands of fireballs fell on our position with deadly accuracy, setting the city ablaze. Next came the Harpies, flying beasts which ascended from the dark skies to pick off our troops. Our anti-aircraft gunners had some success in combating these winged beasts, but our success was short-lived. The ground attack commenced at midnight in the same manner we've come to expect, with hordes of undead assaulting our lines, closely followed by towering demons. Wave after wave of the enemy fell under our fire. One of the demons was slain by heavy artillery fire, resulting in a chorus of cheers from our men, but once again, our victory was only temporary. The demons always fight in threes, and the other 2 reacted with a fury to their comrade's death, smashing our guns to pieces with their flaming swords. Our losses have been heavy, and we've been forced to abandon the suburbs, withdrawing our remaining forces to the city center. Here we shall make our final stand. The final entry was dated the 25th of December, 1942. Today is Christmas Day, but there is no cause for celebration. All the joy, the hope, and the love is gone from the world. All that is left is pain, suffering, and death. The enemy has taken control of the streets, forcing us beneath the ground. We are sequestered in the bunkers underneath the ruins of Reichstag, accommodation originally built for the Führer and his staff. I can hear the wails of the harpies and roars of the demons even through the concrete walls. The beasts are tearing at the steel doors, and it won't be long until they break through. We will fight to the last men and the last bullet. Surrender is not an option. I have had time to think during these hours, to consider what has brought us to this terrible conclusion. Why did the legions of hell so suddenly emerge onto our mortal plane, and why has God abandoned us in our hour of need? I can only conclude that we brought this evil upon ourselves. The horrors we inflicted upon each other during the human war, the carnage and wanton slaughter, we paved the way for Satan's invasion. There was no one else to blame. I can hear them coming for us, tearing down the corridors. This is the end of everything. I had a lump in my throat and tears in my eyes by the time I finished reading the tragic account. I remember my right hand shaking uncontrollably as I continued to grip my pen. I had little time to consider the horrendous implications of what I'd just read, however, as the lecturer shot a sadistic smile and presented his final slide.
And so, our glorious victory was complete. The age of mankind was at an end, and the time had come for our master to claim his spoils of war.
Another film reel played over the projector, this time showing a horrific procession through a ruined city. I saw a company of demons stomping down a rubble-strewn avenue and a flight of hideous harpies soaring in the skies above. Suddenly, the camera panned upwards, showing a dark cloud front above the devastated city. I watched on in mesmerized horror as the clouds transformed and a face emerged from behind them. A horned beast with burning eyes and a wicked, hateful scowl, more terrifying than anything I'd seen up to this point. I swore the beast was staring directly at me as the recording continued. I wanted so badly to look away but was unable to do so, as those hideous eyes held me in a bewitching trance. The film ended as suddenly as it had begun, releasing me from its spell, but my relief was short-lived. To my fresh horror, I realized that everyone in the lecture hall was staring directly at me. The professor's eyes were filled with rage, while the students appeared like wild animals, suddenly transformed into an unholy horde. The lecturer opened his mouth to reveal a gaping blackness, and he pointed and screamed at me with all the force of hell.
You do not belong here!
My instincts kicked in as I realized I had to get out. There was barely any time to grab my notepad before I sprinted up the aisle and towards the exit. The zombified students cried out in unison, emitting banshee-like wails as they darted towards me, their claw-like hands reaching out to grab me. Somehow, I made it through the violent scrum and out the door. I expected fresh air, but was instead confronted by a stifling heat and a foul stench like rotting flesh. When I looked up into the sky, my heart almost dropped. It played out exactly like in the film, the storm clouds parting to reveal his hideous face staring down upon me, his fiery eyes holding me in a paralyzed trance as he opened his maw to reveal rows of shark-like teeth. The beast cackled, his foul laughter nearly deafening me as he reached out with a huge claw, ready to scoop me up and devour my flesh. I screamed out in absolute terror, losing my footing and falling backwards, hitting my head hard across the concrete. I felt a shooting pain inside my skull, and then everything went black. I awoke to concerned faces and a girl frantically calling for an ambulance. They said I'd fallen while running to class, splitting my head open and temporarily losing consciousness. I got taken to the emergency room where I ended up with 20 stitches. There was no permanent damage, not physically at least. The obvious conclusion is that my bizarre and terrifying experience was simply a delusion brought on by my head injury. There's one major problem with this explanation, however. When I looked at my notepad, I discovered the full transcripts I'd written out, confirming the horrific accounts I'd been exposed to. I've had a lot of time to think over the events of that morning and the years since. I don't have any logical explanation for what happened to me, but I do have a theory. I believe I was transported to another dimension, one where the legions of hell conquered the earth in late 1942. I witnessed a terrifying world ruled by Satan, but somehow made it back home. Perhaps someone up there was looking out for me. I don't know. For years, I kept this account to myself due to the fear of being labeled insane, but recently, I read an account of a history buff who visited a demonic museum, and the old traumas came flooding back. In our universe, we mercifully avoided this hellish outcome to World War II, but the devil is still out there in our hell, patiently waiting for his opportunity. I don't know when the attack will come, but I know we must do everything in our power to prevent hell from rising, because the cost of defeat is too horrifying to comprehend. It would be fair to say that I had a problem with authority during my mortal existence. I guess that's why I got assigned the punishment I did once I arrived in hell. As you can imagine, rebellious behavior isn't exactly encouraged here in the underworld. The devil and his cohorts do not tolerate dissent from the damned, and it's definitely not advisable to end up on Satan's wrong side. I wasn't a good guy when I was alive. I guess that goes without saying, but it's worth repeating. However, I'm not the worst man to ever be condemned to the underworld, and I often wonder whether I deserve my fate. I did some bad stuff for sure, but I was never a psychopath or serial killer. In a way, it's a shame I'm not pure evil, because those types tend to do well down here. If you were a murderous dictator or war criminal on Earth, then your skills are going to be very much in demand in this joint. That's as long as you know your place and don't dare to challenge the boss. As for myself, I suppose you could call me one of the lucky ones. That is to say, I wasn't subjected to the eternal torment dished out to millions of damned souls trapped within the 9 circles. Nor was I conscripted into the zombie hordes pulled from the streets of Dis and thrown into the meat grinder, becoming cannon fodder in Satan's endless wars of conquest across multiple dimensions. No, this wasn't to be my fate, either by luck or design. I got picked out from the rabble and assigned to work as a servant in Lucifer's palace, a grand castle of ice located in the very lowest circle of hell. Some think this job is cushy when you consider the alternatives. I would beg to differ. Can you imagine serving as a slave under the most evil and sadistic being in existence, surrounded by twisted demons and the ghosts of some of the most ruthless and bloodthirsty mass murderers in human history? If I ever put a single foot out of line, I face horrendous torture at my master's hands. And therefore, I must live in constant fear, unable to speak my mind or express my disgust at the savagery I'm forced to witness. But this story isn't about me. By an act of divine intervention, I've been given the opportunity to recount my sorry tale. But more importantly, I'm here to share my experiences as an observer of Hell's war upon the mortal plane. I can only hope and pray that my words reach those who will listen, and that I can make some small difference in this screwed-up universe. It is often believed that Lucifer is trapped within the deepest and most severe circle of Hell, Level 9, Treachery, a vast frozen ocean without warmth, life, or hope. Well, this is partly true. The devil is confined to the 9th circle, for now at least, but alas, he is not frozen, helpless, and impotent under the thick ice. Instead, he dwells within a vast palace built from that same icy material, its ugly towers and high walls dominating the 9th circle and acting as a lasting monument to his terrible power. Lucifer rules over Hell with an iron fist, either directly or through his cadre of demonic lieutenants and subordinates. However, Satan's influence wanes the higher one ascends through the circles, and his control of Limbo, the 1st circle, is only nominal. But Hell is not enough for Lucifer. It never has been. His ultimate goal is to conquer Earth, to destroy our world and take ownership of the bodies and souls of every human being. This is what he's been working towards for millennia, and there's nothing he won't do to achieve this victory. And how do I know this? Because I've witnessed his invasion firsthand. But even with his vast armies, his many fifth columnists, and his world-ending weaponry, Satan is not unopposed in these wars. And I know the forces of good are still up for this fight. But let me take you back to the day when Lucifer launched his latest blood-soaked invasion. Me and my fellow slaves were on duty inside of the war room, buried deep within the icy chambers beneath Lucifer's fortified palace. How can I describe the war room? Well, my descriptive skills are likely not up to the task, but I see the room as a cross between a futuristic military command center and a medieval great hall. The walls were carved from the ice many thousands of years ago, and, as you would imagine, the interior is bitterly cold. At least for us damned souls who are dressed in little more than sparse, filthy rags. We shiver through our duties, knowing all too well the harsh penalty for making any complaint. In the center of the chamber sits a huge round table made from the finest marble. The fact that the table is circular might suggest that all who sit around it are equal in status, but I can assure you this isn't the case. Lucifer sits upon a mighty throne of twisted iron, which towers above the wooden chairs of the other attendees. There is no doubt who is in charge inside of that room, and all others are in fearful awe of Satan's immense power. The military operations are managed through a three-dimensional projection of our globe, which appears above the center of the vast round table. Although whether this visual representation is created by advanced technology or black magic, I cannot say. In any case, Lucifer and his generals are able to zoom in to observe the many battlefields around the globe, projecting images of extreme violence for the viewing pleasure of the sadistic audience as they watch their bloodthirsty invasion play out. One thing you need to understand about Hell is that time moves at a different rate than on our world. It seems that Lucifer can bend time and space to his own will. In any event, an invasion that may last weeks, months, or even years on the mortal plane can pass in mere hours or minutes inside Hell's war room. As for the role of me and my fellow slaves, well, our job is to cater to every whim of Lucifer and his demonic generals. We will bring them fresh meat, whose origins I dare not imagine, alcohol, narcotics, and sexual partners of their preference, although Lucifer forbids such activities during wartime as being unnecessary distractions. And sometimes our only function is to act as punching bags for their verbal and physical abuse. We're dealing with a cruel and sadistic crowd after all, and we slaves have no rights. We can only stand there, take their abuse in good humor, and hope the demons don't subject us to more severe tortures. What's important, however, is that we are present, and even though our masters insist we remain silent and invisible, we witness all that occurs in that horrifying room. And I saw it all on that extraordinary day in the pits of hell. Let me begin by introducing the cast of this horrid tale. Well, there's the main man, of course, Lucifer, Satan, the devil, Lord of the Flies. He is probably the second most powerful entity in existence, and boy, he's pissed about not being number one. Satan has been bitter and enraged ever since his failed rebellion and banishment from God's kingdom. For millennia he has dwelt in hellish exile and plotted his revenge, a twisted obsession which has entirely consumed him. The devil holds all the power in his realm and is not afraid to demonstrate this fact. I have personally witnessed the devil ripping his victims limb from limb with his bare hands, only to summon a dark magic to stitch them back together again. He then repeats the process, driving his victims mad in the process. The only limit in the devil's realm is his own twisted imagination. Satan can also take many physical forms: a horned minotaur, a black dog with burning red eyes, and a crimson dragon which spits white fire. But when he's inside the war room, the devil takes on a human form, that of a slick and handsome politician dressed in a finely tailored designer suit. Or perhaps this is just how he appears to me. I guess it makes no difference in the end. I am sure of one thing, however. No one who's ever laid eyes upon the devil on his home turf could ever mistake him. I don't know whether it's his piercing, predatory eyes or his booming, godlike voice, but Lucifer has a dark aura around him which forces all to submit to his will out of sheer terror. Despite the vast size of the subterranean chamber, the devil likes to keep his war council small, and on the day I witnessed the events I will recount, only half a dozen were present around the table. So, let me introduce you to Satan's unholy six. 3 of their number are demons, fallen angels who've been with the devil ever since his failed rebellion in heaven. There are many thousands of demons within the ranks of Hell's army, but these 3 are at the top of the pile, Lucifer's most trusted lieutenants and advisors, dedicated to implementing his horrific plans and fully prepared to inflict mass casualties in their pursuit of total victory. They also take the appearance of human beings while sitting around the war table, but I've seen their true, monstrous forms, like the 60-foot-tall minotaurs wielding flaming swords, their horrifying roars filling the air as they storm into battle. That's a sight you'll never forget. Believe me. First and foremost is Ashtaroth, the great Duke of Hell and Satan's right-hand man. Highly intelligent, devious, and totally ruthless, Ashtaroth is notorious for his Machiavellian political skills and aptitude for extreme violence. When this demon meets your eye, you'll feel a cold chill running up your spine as you imagine the horrors he's calculating inside his twisted mind. He is definitely to be avoided if at all possible. Next in line is Minos, judge of the dead and gatekeeper of the second circle. All who enter hell must pass through Minos and face his judgment, and he will decide your fate and assign you to one of the torturous 9 circles. In addition to his gatekeeper role, Minos is also responsible for recruitment into Hell's army. Millions of lost souls make up the rank and file of Satan's combat divisions. They're cannon fodder, of course, entirely expendable and ready to be thrown into the meat grinder at a moment's notice. These soldiers are press-ganged into service, but most are grateful to escape the endless torment of the circles. Minos is known to take the form of a bearded giant with a snake-like tail which wraps around his muscular body, but in the war room, he looks quite normal, handsome even, although with a well-concealed malice behind his dark eyes. On the surface, Minos is a loyal lieutenant serving under Lucifer, although I always sensed an underlying tension between the two. Last of the demons is Leviathan, Grand Admiral and commander of Satan's naval force. Pale-skinned, robed, and hairless, Leviathan takes the form of a warlock whilst attending the council. He is indeed very powerful. He alone has the ability to summon and command the gigantic Kraken, ancient sea monsters which slumber in the darkest depths of the ocean, waiting to rise to the surface and wreak havoc upon our shipping lanes and ports. These Kraken are vast in size, and one is easily capable of grasping hold of an aircraft carrier or oil tanker with its mighty tentacles before dragging the boat down into the icy depths. And Leviathan doesn't just have one sea monster under his control, he has dozens. Satan's admiral says little during these war councils, but there's no doubt he plays a crucial role in the devil's devious plans. The other 3 council members are not demons, but rather damned souls. These are Satan's generals, hand-picked to coordinate his invasion and command his vast armies. All were famous, or infamous, military leaders, who I suspect you might have heard of. First, there's Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox, as he was known on the mortal plane. The German general became famous due to his stunning performance as a tank commander during World War II, serving in France, North Africa, and France again before his death in October 1944. As he sat in the war room, Rommel looked near identical to the photographs I recall seeing in the history books, right down to his chiseled Aryan looks and spotless Wehrmacht officer's uniform. The German may have been deceased, but he remains a true professional committed to winning, even if the cause isn't his own. He is considered the best of Satan's generals, and has a position of authority over the others. Next around the table is Belisarius, military commander of the Byzantine Empire during the 6th century and instrumental in reconquering most of the Mediterranean during a series of battles and wars spanning several decades. Sometimes called the last of the Romans, Belisarius is remembered on our world as a great strategist and brave general who fought side by side with his troops. But ultimately, Belisarius was betrayed by Emperor Justinian, who ordered his general's eyes put out, leaving him a blind beggar on the streets of Rome for the remainder of his life. In death, he remains blind, but his other senses are sharpened, and his strategic senses are as good as they were during his glory days. With his eyes removed and his hair and beard white and disheveled, Belisarius doesn't look like much at first glance, but he's been fighting Lucifer's wars for centuries and should not be underestimated. Last but not least on Satan's council is Boudica, queen of the ancient Iceni tribe, who led an uprising against the Roman occupiers in 1st century Britain. Clad in red robes and with long flowing hair, Boudica is known for her beauty, but also her skill and strength in battle. Her name comes from the Celtic word for victory, and, despite her eventual defeat and death, Boudica is remembered as a heroine in Britain and beyond. This raises the question of how these military leaders ended up in hell leading Lucifer's vile legions. They are hardly the evilest villains from history after all. Nevertheless, Rommel was Hitler's general. Belisarius slaughtered civilians during the Nika riots, and Boudica's army put 80,000 Romans to the sword during her bloody rebellion. The truth is, few escape from war without committing mortal sins. And you're probably wondering why the worst monsters and mass killers from history don't have a seat at the table. Where are Genghis Khan, Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, you might ask? Well, don't worry, they're all here in hell. The trouble is, such megalomaniacs don't take well to being number two, and Satan never fully trusts these dictators, as he fears they'll stage a revolt against his rule. For those reasons, these human monsters are regulated to the very lowest level of hell, a little-known torture chamber located beneath the frozen sea of the Ninth Circle. Down in the icy depths, they are subjected to unimaginable and endless torture. You can sometimes hear their desperate, mad screaming through the ice, a chilling reminder of the fate of those who would dare challenge Satan in his own kingdom. So, on that fateful day, the huge ice chamber which served as the devil's war room was the place of work for me and two other damned souls. I don't know their names or what they did in life to end up down here. One learns pretty quickly that hell isn't a place for making friends. The two young men who served alongside me were anonymous and largely silent, but I could see the pure terror in their eyes and knew that they were as scared and horrified as I was. But that didn't make us allies. Desperate souls have a habit of stabbing you in the back. It's every man or woman for themselves in hell. I learned this lesson the hard way. The three of us stood silently at the back of the chamber, beside a table of both raw and cooked meat, countless bottles of alcohol and drugs of every description. We would obediently serve the demonic attendees whatever they wanted, although I knew from past experience that Lucifer didn't want hedonistic distractions during his invasions, and so we were likely to remain as silent observers throughout the events to come. Now, this wasn't the first time I'd witnessed this sequence of events, but I'm always awestruck when the devil summons a three-dimensional globe the size of a soccer field above the war table, an incredibly detailed and live holographic image of the planet Earth. When he did so, I looked upon the green continents and blue oceans of my homeworld and felt a terrible sickness deep in the pit of my stomach, because I knew what was coming next and felt for the billions of people who were about to suffer a horrific fate. And then Lucifer spoke to the open proceedings, his booming, godlike voice filling the huge chamber with ease.
Our battlefield, Earth 217, ripe for the picking. I trust our preparations have been completed.
Ashtaroth, Lucifer's second in command, responded without missing a beat, his voice low and raspy, but full of malice.
Yes, indeed, my lord. The four horsemen have been busy doing what they do best, spreading fear, misery, and hatred throughout the globe. May I?
Lucifer gave his subordinate a curt nod, and the demon used his black magic to take control of the holographic globe, zooming in on each continent as he provided his quick-fire briefing.
In Africa, we have multiple wars, famines, and pestilence. The conflict between NATO and Russia is heating up in Eastern Europe. The Middle East is in bloody chaos. The Chinese are preparing for their seaborne invasion of Taiwan. North Korea will soon attack their neighbors to the south. The United States is sleepwalking into civil war. The global economy has all but collapsed. The environment is rapidly deteriorating. People are scared, angry, and increasingly desperate.
Good, very good.
The devil replied with a sadistic glee.
And what of our forces?
It was Minos who answered this time, delivering his summary in a business-like tone like he was a high-up bureaucrat.
All is progressing on schedule, my lord. 20 million lost souls harvested from the 9 circles, their energy converted into balls of flame. Half are ready to fire against their assigned targets, while the other half will be held in reserve. 50 million undead pulled from the slums of Dis are standing by to advance in the first wave. 100,000 demons have been mobilized into our elite legions and deployed to the Hellmouths. 500,000 harpies will descend from the skies, and 250,000 wolfmen have already entered the mortal realm to prepare the way for our invasion.
Good,
Lucifer replied, although not as enthusiastically as before. His invasion plans relied upon Minos' efficiency and his ability to mobilize vast armies from the 9 circles. Nevertheless, I got the distinct impression that the devil didn't fully trust Minos and regarded him as a potential rival.
Last but certainly not least, what of our naval force?
The devil inquired. Leviathan answered in a soft voice, which somehow still managed to carry across the chamber to my ears.
All is as it should be, my lord. The Krakens are awakening from their slumber, and shall soon rise from the depths to take control of the 5 oceans. Likewise, our serpent hordes stand ready to attack ports on every coastline. Fine. Well, I see no reason to delay. Let us begin the first phase.
Next came the moment I'd been dreading so badly, as the Lord of Hell unleashed death and destruction upon the world with a mere click of his fingers. My companions and I could only watch on in terror as many natural disasters occurred across the globe. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, forest fires, tsunamis, floods, hurricanes, and tornadoes, all happening simultaneously and on every continent. The purpose of these disasters was to disrupt communications and destroy infrastructure, making it much more difficult for the world's governments and militaries to coordinate an effective defense. Lucifer zoomed in on individual regions and nations so he could examine the devastation in closer detail. We bore witness to cities destroyed, forests burning, and endless columns of refugees fleeing from disaster zones. On Earth, days or weeks had passed, but in Satan's war room, it seemed like it had all happened in mere minutes. When Lucifer was satisfied, he moved on to the next phase of the invasion. All of a sudden, we witnessed the Earth's crust opening up, as vast boreholes appeared in each and every continent. 1,000 deep and black cavities which linked the mortal world with the dreaded 9 circles of the underworld. These were the Hellmouths, the means by which Lucifer's armies would launch their devastating assault upon the people of Earth. And so, the groundwork had been laid. The demons had sown the seeds and mobilized the army, and Satan had opened the gateways between the worlds. Now, the responsibility fell to the 3 generals who would coordinate the military operation. I watched as Rommel, Belisarius, and Boudica came to life, assuming the role of all-powerful war machines activated to manage a vast global conflict with clinical and brutal efficiency. Their eyes were closed, with the exception of Belisarius, who no longer had eyes. One would think they were running the war blind, but the deceased generals all had strategic brains capable of seeing the battlefields in their mind's eye and coordinating offensives on multiple fronts simultaneously. Lucifer had granted them all immense power, but it all came at a heavy price. The military leaders knew that they had to deliver results. The devil would accept nothing less than total victory, and if his generals failed to deliver, well, there were always spare cells in the torture chambers below the ice. It's fair to say these generals were operating under intense pressure, but they showed no outward signs of anxiety or stress as their conversation was emotionless and all business.
Status reports,
Rommel ordered. The German was the senior of the 3, and so the others reported to him.
Our targets in the Western Europe theater are more dispersed than our reconnaissance indicated,
said Boudica.
We will require a 10% increase in fireball munitions to eliminate all NATO bases.
Authorized,
Rommel replied after only a moment's hesitation, time he no doubt used to analyze the potential impact of the request upon the overall war effort. Belisarius spoke next, saying,
Our zombie hordes are taking significant losses on the North American continent. Request advanced deployment of 1 legion from the Demon Corps.
Negative,
Rommel replied soon after.
A full legion will deplete our reserves beyond the acceptable margin of error. 5 cohorts will have to suffice.
Belisarius accepted the decision without argument, his powerful brain focused upon resolving the problem. A tense silence ensued before Boudica spoke again, reporting,
Pakistan has unilaterally deployed nuclear weapons earlier than our projections predicted. They've launched multiple missiles towards the Kashmir Hellmouth.
Rommel thought for a brief moment before delivering his next orders.
Eliminate what's left of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. Redeploy the remainder of our forces in the region through the Ganges and Persian Hellmouths.
Done.
Boudica replied confidently. I tuned out from the conversation, instead focusing upon the terrible images appearing before me, as the devil and his demon subordinates zoomed in on the holographical globe to observe their bloodthirsty invasion in close quarters. The horrifying scenes included a pack of savage werewolves tearing through what looked like an army barracks, ripping unprepared soldiers to shreds as they emerged from their cots. Next, I saw an airbase being assaulted by dozens of flaming fireballs. The control tower was already ablaze, as fighter jets were blown apart by precision strikes before they could even take off. Next came images of zombie hordes on the streets of Paris, tearing into civilians and soldiers alike in a sickening bloodbath. 60-foot-tall demons stomping across cornfields and smashing armored vehicles and tanks to pieces with their flaming swords. Winged harpies descending from blood-red skies to slaughter a line of terrified refugees. A mighty kraken pulling a destroyer down to the icy depths with its mighty tentacles, and a horde of sea serpents slithering along a concrete deck and swallowing whole any who stood in their way. And so it went. Unfortunately, this wasn't the first time I'd seen genocide play out. Lucifer and his legions had already launched this assault upon multiple dimensions, conquering alternate versions of Earth and slaughtering countless millions in the process. This invasion plan was tried and tested. Each time I witnessed the bloodbath, I secretly hoped that things would turn out differently. But they never did. Surely the conclusion was inevitable. The three generals were facing challenges, but nothing they couldn't handle. Satan's forces had an overwhelming advantage over the scattered and divided armies of humanity, whose leadership would have been largely wiped out in the first attacks. Lucifer seemed pleased, but his short temper was notorious, as one of my fellow servants would soon learn in the most brutal fashion. The devil was clearly enjoying the sight of humanity being slaughtered in the millions. He always did. But Lucifer enjoyed sustenance and refreshment whilst he watched cities burn.
You, slave!
He suddenly cried out.
Bring me meat and mead.
Thankfully, the order wasn't directed towards me, but rather the servant who stood to my left, an emaciated young man with bloodshot eyes, who looked like he was about to have a heart attack. I felt sympathy as I watched the kid pile up slices of meat upon a silver platter and filling a fine goblet with golden ale. I could see his hand shaking almost uncontrollably as he carried the food and drink across the ice-covered floor of the chamber. I'm afraid what happened next was all too predictable. The kid tripped over his own feet while still about 6 feet away from the war table, heavily falling to the floor while dropping the meat and spilling the drink on the ice. Satan's reaction to this mishap was instant and furious, turning his attention from the war for long enough to punish the transgression. In an instant, the terrified kid had been lifted off the ground by an unseen force, his body briefly hovering in midair before he was flung across the chamber at a tremendous speed. I could only look on as the kid's helpless body was pinned against the icy wall of the chamber. He screamed in absolute terror, but a moment later, I heard a sickening crack as Satan snapped the victim's spine like a twig before allowing his paralyzed body to collapse to the ground. The crippled servant looked at us with pain and shock in his eyes, trying to mouth a plea for help, although he was no longer able to speak or move. The kid's body was broken, but he wouldn't die. No one could in hell, but he could still feel pain, of course. Lucifer had punished his slave, and perhaps he'd restore the kid's body later, if he was feeling generous. In the meantime, there was still a job to be done.
Clean up this mess and bring me what I desire,
Lucifer demanded. He hadn't directed his order to anyone specifically, but there were only 2 of us left now, and my companion was frozen in fear, seemingly unable to move from the spot. I knew it was up to me, otherwise we would all suffer an even worse fate. Working quickly, I scampered across the ice and collected the dropped items in my shaking hands before retreating back to the food table, piling up fresh meat and refilling the goblet. I don't know how, but I summoned the strength to serve the devil his meal. As I carefully set the plate and goblet down on the table, Satan cast me a brief glance, glaring through me with his hateful eyes before dismissing me with utter contempt. I bowed my head in submission before retreating from the war table, relieved that I hadn't been crippled or subjected to some sort of perverse torture for the devil's amusement. Meanwhile, the destruction of Earth continued as the war drew towards what seemed like an inevitable conclusion.
My lord,
Rommel announced.
the world's surviving political and military leaders are discussing their final strategy.
Ashtaroth interrupted at this point, speaking for the first time since the beginning of the briefing.
Our agents have been working hard, whispering our message in the ears of desperate politicians and generals. I am confident that they will decide to deploy the nuclear option.
Excellent.
The devil replied with a twisted grin on his lips. You might find it crazy that Lucifer and his minions would actually want the human race to use nuclear weapons and effectively destroy the planet in the process. But in fact, this is all part of the plan. The devil doesn't care if his armies are disintegrated in atomic fires. He can always replace his foot soldiers. There's no shortage of damned souls in the 9 circles after all. Nuclear apocalypse will do nothing to stop his invasion, but it will hasten the extinction of humanity, which is the ultimate goal. Believe me when I say Satan is quite happy to burn the whole world down just so he can rule over the ashes. I had tears in my eyes and a sickness in the pit of my stomach as I watched the missile launch sites light up across the globe, both from ICBM silos and nuclear submarines at sea. Soon, thousands of missiles rose into orbit before beginning their descent towards their targets. I lowered my head in grief, feeling sure that I was about to witness the death of yet another world, but what happened next was something I never could have anticipated. I saw flashes of white light and looked up at the globe, astonished as the missiles were plucked from the air one by one, taken by an unidentified force before they could hit their targets and detonate. It seemed like this development took everyone by surprise, as the tension inside the chamber nearly reached the breaking point. A lengthy pause ensued as we all watched the nuclear apocalypse being diverted, and then Lucifer reacted with predictable fury.
What is this? What have you morons done?
His tirade was aimed towards his 3 generals, their former confidence now gone. The normally unflappable Rommel was suddenly lost for words, his jaw dropping and eyes widening in raw panic. Instead, it was left to Boudica to blurt out a response.
My lord, we have followed the protocols to the letter. There's no way we could have predicted this development.
Unacceptable!
The devil screamed.
I will not tolerate failure!
In an instant, Lucifer rose from his throne and raised his claw-like hands, summoning fire from thin air and shooting a stream of napalm-like flames towards the trio of hapless generals. The 3 didn't even have time to flee before the unholy fire engulfed them all, burning their undead bodies in a horrific inferno as their blood-curdling screams echoed off the chamber walls. I knew I could well be next, and so I instinctively dived for cover behind the food table. The devil missed me, but my companion wasn't so lucky. He tried to run, but didn't get far. Lucifer must have seen him out of the corner of his eye, and he fired a ball of white flames which hit the servant as he ran, burning his skin and flesh in a sickening display. I remained in hiding as Satan remonstrated his demon lieutenants.
How the hell did this happen?
He asked angrily.
I demand an explanation.
Ashtaroth struggled to come up with an answer, his usually cool demeanor beginning to crack.
My lord, this is an unexpected setback to be sure, but there is no need for despair. We can regroup our forces and—
Suddenly, Minos interrupted, much to his fellow demon's annoyance.
My lord, perhaps this is the scenario we previously discussed. It appears to me that Heaven's forces have intervened to disrupt our invasion.
Lucifer turned on his subordinate, a renewed fury in his dark eyes as he spat.
Lies! He would not dare to challenge me!
Either by chance or design, the response to the devil's defiant words was instantaneous, as a thunderous roar filled the chamber, and the ice-covered ceiling above us was broken. a vast hole appearing as a bolt of lightning tore through, striking the center of the marble war table and smashing it to 1,000,000 pieces. The devil roared as he stepped up from his throne and prepared for battle. But a moment later, a second thunderous bolt struck, lighting up the dark chamber and hitting Lucifer directly, throwing him off his feet and down to the ice. I was astonished by this sudden turn of events, but the battle had only just begun. I looked up as a trio of figures engulfed in white light soared through the newly created hole in the ceiling and descended into the chamber. 3 angelic warriors, each one winged, 12 feet in height, and ferocious looking. They landed in the center of the chamber and emitted furious war cries as they drew their weapons and threw themselves into battle. At their heads was a woman with long, flowing blonde hair and a sword of white flames. Behind her were 2 male angels with stern faces and wielding long war pikes with sharpened tips that lit up in the dark. The devil remained on the floor after the lightning strike. I hoped he was dead, but knew this was likely impossible. But he was unable to fight in that moment, so it was left to his demonic lieutenants to defend his inner sanctum. Astaroth and Leviathan soon rose from their seats and began to transform into horrifying monsters. Astaroth rapidly grew in size as horns emerged from his head and his teeth turned into razor-sharp fangs. A flaming sword of red fire appeared in his claw-like hands as he screamed and charged into the fight, meeting the female angel in the center of the chamber as their magical blades clashed. Meanwhile, Leviathan's arms transformed into long tentacles adorned with suckers and hooks, while his mouth became a hideous squid-like beak. He reached out with his left tentacle, taking one of the male angels by surprise as he wrapped his appendage around the angel's vulnerable body, squeezing with immense strength and crushing his screaming victim without mercy. Leviathan attempted to repeat the trick with the third angel, but the winged warrior was too quick, dodging the attack before thrusting the spear straight through the monster's beak. The spear penetrated deep into the demon's throat, forcing the beast to squeal in pain as he collapsed onto the ice. Minos was the last of the 3 demons, and his response to the violence was telling. He chose not to stand and fight against the angelic assault, instead fleeing to the heavy iron doors and exiting the chamber, slamming the door behind him. I don't know whether Minos fled due to cowardice or lack of loyalty, but his hasty retreat from the battleground placed Hell's forces in a precarious position. Astaroth and the female angel fought a fierce sword battle across the chamber floor, but the ancient demon had not fought hand-to-hand for a long time, and so his opponent eventually got the better of him. The demon swung his sword and missed, burying his blade in the cold ice. As he struggled to recover, the angel cut through him with her sword, slicing through his torso and causing the beast to cry out in agony as his dark blood spilled. Both demons were now down. They were hurt badly, but could not die, at least not here in Hell. Their broken bodies would eventually heal and regenerate, but for now they were wounded and helpless, leaving the remaining 2 angels to control the war chamber. But their advantage was short-lived, as Satan suddenly recovered consciousness and leapt to his feet, surveying his enemies with the eyes of a hungry predator as he unleashed the full extent of his power. With a swing of his arms, the devil broke the surviving male angel's spear in half and flung him across the chamber, snapping his body in 2 and leaving his victim squirming on the floor. This left the female angel alone to face the devil's wrath. She was strong and fierce, but no match for Lucifer's dark powers. The devil's eyes lit up with sadistic glee as he summoned all the energy in the room and fired a stream of deadly fire towards the angel. She blocked the flames with her sword, but the attack was so powerful that she was thrown off her feet. Satan's cruel grin widened as he closed in for the kill. The angelic warrior was weakened but not beaten yet. She raised her sword in the air and cried out a prayer, appealing to a higher power. The response from heaven was instantaneous, as a second later, a fresh bolt of lightning, the most powerful yet, tore through the hole in the ceiling, using the angel's sword as a conductor. Her blade burned fiercely as she absorbed it and made use of God's immense energy. Aiming the sword, she fired a stream of blue fire, but it was not directed at Lucifer's body, but rather at the ground he stood upon. The ice under his feet shattered, and Lucifer screamed as he fell into the freezing waters below. His body disappeared under the surface. In an instant, the ice was reformed, trapping him underneath. The 12-foot angel pulled herself up from the floor, sheathing her weapon and surveying the carnage around her. I hoped she wouldn't notice me cowering behind the food table, but of course she saw me.
Come now, child. The danger has passed. Emerge from your hiding place and come speak with me.
I did so, nervously walking over to the mighty winged warrior on shaking feet. I felt sure that I would face divine punishment for my role in these events, but when I looked up into her deep blue eyes, I saw compassion and empathy, emotions I'd nearly forgotten during my time in the depths of hell.
My name is Ariel, and I have been placed in command of God's forces in the battle to save Earth from Satan's legions.
I was still confused, and I had so many unanswered questions. I don't understand, I whimpered. This invasion has played out so many times across the dimensions. I've seen it happen on world after world, and this was the first time you people have intervened.
It is true that we've joined this battle late. Humanity has brought much of its suffering upon themselves through their sinful actions. Still, my Lord will not abandon mankind in their hour of need. We have taken the fight to Lucifer's home turf and given him a bloody nose. The war will continue, of course, but the tide is turning. Look.
She pointed towards the holographic globe, now restored above the shattered and empty war table. Ariel was able to zoom in to show live scenes of the battlefields across the earth. I saw many images which cheered my aching spirit. Hordes of zombies suddenly dropping dead on city streets, fireballs exploding harmlessly in midair, sea serpents retreating back into the waves, and once mighty demons fleeing in terror, stomping across ravaged lands before descending back into the hellmouths. The surviving human defenders seemed astonished by this extraordinary turn of events, but soldiers and civilians soon began passionate celebrations at their unexpected victory. Few on Earth 217 would ever know how close they'd come to total annihilation. The tears I shed this time were those of joy, but there was still one important question on my mind. Ariel looked upon me with sympathy in her eyes, as if she anticipated what I was going to ask. What will happen to me? I whimpered. Will you take me out of here? Deep down, I think I knew the answer I was going to receive, but I guess it was worth a shot. However, I swore I could hear regret in Ariel's voice as she replied.
Alas, my child. This is beyond my power. You are a sinner, and there is still a price to be paid. But perhaps you can take solace in knowing that the fight back against Lucifer's evil is at hand, and nowhere is safe for him now. Not even here.
It did warm my heart to know that there was at least a glimmer of hope. I suddenly knew what I had to do. My selfishness and lack of compassion for others had brought me to this place, but now I realized I was part of something much bigger than myself. I want to help, I said confidently whilst looking up into the mighty angel's blue eyes. I want to play my part in this war, no matter how small it is. Ariel smiled before replying.
Very well, child. You have an important story to tell and a vital message to deliver to the mortal plane. I will permit you to do so, in the hope that this will assist our righteous cause.
And so here it is, my story, for what it's worth. Many will refuse to believe my account and will not heed my warning, but I think some will realize what is coming and will make the necessary preparations, both practical and spiritual. This war is far from over. In the end, every Earth in the multiverse will have to face the threat of Hell's invasions, but humanity is not alone in this fight, and with Heaven's help, we can prevail. My own fate is unclear. It is highly likely that the devil will punish me for my transgressions, but he will never break my renewed spirit. And if your sinful past brings you to Hell's 9 circles, please know that you'll have at least one ally among the millions of lost souls. Godspeed, my friends. I awoke with a sudden gasp, my eyes shooting open as they slowly adjusted to my new surroundings. I felt a stifling heat and struggled to move. soon realizing I was laying upon a hard, molten rock, facing upwards as I looked up at a blood-red sky. My whole body ached and every moment was agony, but eventually I was able to lift one arm and then the other, slowly raising my hands up to my face so I could touch my cheeks. I couldn't explain it, but my skin was ice cold, even though the temperature was boiling hot. And suddenly, my ears were filled with a cacophony of sounds, shouts, screams, animalistic roars, gunshots, and the clink of metal against metal. I had awoken to chaos, and my instincts told me I was in mortal danger. I used my hands to push myself up off the rocky surface, but my head was spinning and I felt dizzy, and suddenly I was aware of two figures standing over me. I couldn't focus on their faces in that moment, but I could hear their voices as they spoke.
"Fresh meat for Minos' army,"
said the first. The voice was deep, but I could tell it was a woman.
"Come on, soldier, on your feet,"
said the second, gruff male voice. The unidentified man put his hand out to help me up. I paused for a moment, feeling hesitant as I naturally didn't trust this stranger, but in the end, I accepted his assistance, placing my hand in his. The mystery man's palm was ice cold, but his grip was true, and so I was soon pulled up to my feet, my legs shaking for a moment before I steadied myself. Next, I looked to the man who'd helped me up, noting his scarred, weathered face and the cold look in his emotionless eyes. He wore a tattered gray uniform which looked like it belonged in a museum and held a rusty but sharp machete in his other hand. I recognized a seasoned warrior when I saw one, but the soldier didn't speak, instead looking me over with suspicion and perhaps contempt. I broke eye contact with him, instead looking to the woman standing to his right. She was smaller and leaner than her male companion, but no less intimidating in appearance. Her dark hair was cut short, and her uniform was a more modern set of camouflage fatigues. She had a crossbow over one shoulder with bolts attached to her utility belt. I noted how there was a spark in her eyes which was missing from her male companion, and she had a thin smile on her face as she looked me up and down.
"Well, he's not the best recruit we've seen,"
she proclaimed sarcastically.
"but I guess we need every man we can get."
"Yes. Well, we best get him knitted up, armed, and prepped,"
the man replied hesitantly. I had held my tongue up to this point, but could no longer do so. As I opened my bone-dry lips and practically spat out the words, "Excuse me, how about you tell me what the hell's going on, huh? Where the hell am I?" They both looked at me like I was stupid, and the woman smirked as she answered,
"Interesting choice of words, my friend. Why not take a look over the horizon?"
And I did so, slowly turning my head and casting my eyes upon a scene of utter horror. The three of us stood upon a barren hill of molten rock, looking down upon a burning city under a blood-red sky. On the far western horizon, I saw a dark body of water which surrounded the urban landscapes and noted the warlike sailing ships anchored offshore. The city itself was vast, stretching for miles in every direction. The structure appeared to be medieval in design, consisting of stone houses, narrow alleyways, high bell towers, and defensive battlements. To the north sat a grand tower of black iron, surrounded by thick and high walls with many turrets. The huge fortress was at the center of the city and dominated the skyline, but the narrow streets and smaller buildings below it were in a state of chaos, as structures burned and thousands of soldiers fought running battles in the squares and down the back streets, filling the thick air with their war cries and screams. I stood there on the hillside for a long moment, awestruck as I observed the vast urban battle play out in 100 small skirmishes. I was no stranger to combat, but this battle zone was alien to me, appearing like no war-torn city I'd ever seen. It all seemed unreal, and I told myself there must be a logical explanation. I still believed this right up until I saw the beast emerge from the dark waters, its horned head and hideous maw rising above the surface, soon followed by its huge body adorned with heavy steel armor. The beast roared as it pulled itself out of the water and stepped onto the dock, its heavy hoofs cracking the ground as it came. The beast was thankfully some distance away from us, but I could see its entire form, noting how the monster towered above the harbor and the buildings below it. Every aspect of the beast was terrifying, from its minotaur-like body, its horned head, burning red eyes, and maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. And when it roared, the hellish sound carried across the vast space and chilled me to my bones. In an instant, the Minotaur unveiled a sword of fire and thumped along the city streets, smashing houses under its huge hooves as it came. and then it started to attack people on the streets, slicing the small figures to pieces with ease as it roared aloud with bloody fury. It appeared as if nothing could stop the giant marauding demon, but the man-sized figures fought back in the most extraordinary manner, as dozens of attackers jumped onto the demon's goat-like legs and started to climb upward, soon swarming the beast as they spread all over its mighty body. The demon reacted with fury, ripping the attackers off its legs, arms, and chest before snapping them in two and throwing them into the stone walls, but the attackers kept coming, and before long there were hundreds of them swarming all over the furious demon, stabbing him with short swords and machetes. The beast couldn't kill all of its attackers and was soon overwhelmed, bleeding from 1,000 cuts as it slowly fell, its roars fading as its huge frame heavily collapsed to the ground. The surviving attackers who avoided being crushed cheered in triumph as they finished their deadly assault. "What the hell?" I swore under my breath.
Welcome to the party. It's quite something, isn't it?
Said the woman as she walked up beside me. I swung around, glaring at her smirking face before I turned to see the deadpan eyes of her male companion. "Where are we?" I asked through trembling lips.
You were right the first time. This is hell. More specifically, violence. The Fifth Circle. The city of Dis.
My jaw dropped and my blood turned to ice. I was hoping she was joking, but when I looked to the man, he nodded firmly to confirm. I was literally left speechless, my mind racing as I desperately tried to make sense of this madness. But the woman surprised me by approaching and placing her cold hand on my shoulder before speaking sympathetically in my ear.
It's a big adjustment, but we'll help you through. My name's Isabel, by the way.
She turned her head towards her companion before continuing.
And that jarhead over there is Sebastian.
I nodded my head nervously, feeling that the introductions brought some degree of normality to this otherwise insane situation. Hi, I'm Jacob.
Nice to meet your acquaintance, Jacob. Come on, we'll get you kitted up and show you how things work around here.
Isabel said with a half smile as she removed her hand from my shoulder. Isabel and Sebastian turned their backs on me and started to walk down the hillside, presumably expecting me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, looking back over the burning city and seeing the body of the butchered demon, but to my horror, I saw another two monsters emerge from the dark water, repeating the previous assault as they drew swords of fire, roaring with fury as they went to battle against the horde. This was my introduction to the battle for Dis, a savage civil war for control of Hell's capital. I'd had a taste of the horror and bloodshed, but this was only the beginning of my hellish odyssey. I followed my new companions down the barren hillside and towards the city. I was still in a daze, unable to believe that any of this was real, and still holding out hope that I was experiencing a vivid nightmare or hallucination. But all the details persuaded me otherwise, from the stifling heat to the blood-curdling screams and the foul stench of burning flesh and creeping death. But it only got worse as we progressed down the dirt path. I saw the spikes driven into the hard ground on both sides of the pathway, but it was only when I got closer that I realized the horrifying truth. Each spike was adorned by several human heads. There were dozens of impaled skulls stretching for the best part of a mile. All were in varying states of decomposition, but I noted how their eyes remained open and staring out towards us, and their mouths were trapped in silent screams. My jaw dropped as I felt a sickness rising from the pit of my stomach. I spent a lot of time on the front line and had witnessed some appalling atrocities, but this was an act of medieval brutality. I didn't want to look into the faces of the dead men and women, but couldn't help myself as I was mesmerized by the sheer horror of the spectacle. But there was something else. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I saw the victims watching me as I walked past. Their eyes filled with madness as they attempted to move their bloodied lips to scream. "Holy shit!" I cried out in dismay, stopping in my tracks as I did so. Isabel turned to face me, frowning as she offered an explanation.
Deserters. Minos and his enforcers don't take kindly to dissent within the ranks.
I was shocked by her coldness, but also baffled. "But their eyes are moving. These people are still alive." Isabel shrugged her shoulders before replying.
Don't feel sorry for them. They got what they deserved. Technically speaking, we're all dead already. You get a physical body when you arrive here, but only the one. They'll burn you, mutilate you, chop off your head, but there's no release, no end to the pain. Even if your physical form ceases to exist, your damned and disembodied soul will still inhabit this hell for all eternity.
She paused briefly, perhaps for a dramatic effect, before continuing.
Sometimes you can hear the voices in the wind, mad laughter and insane ramblings, the product of demented minds.
I stared at her for a long moment, a cold chill running down my spine as the terrifying implications of her words hit home. Next, I looked to Sebastian in desperation, hoping for some reassurance from the giant man, a few words, but all I got was a hard stare and an uncompromising order.
We need to keep moving.
I didn't think it was wise to go against this veteran soldier, but I had reached the end of my tether, experiencing a fiery defiance as I spoke out. No! This is bullshit! I'm not taking another step until you people tell me what's going on. What are we doing here? Sebastian's response surprised me, because he bellowed laughter before he spoke.
We're doing what we've always done, soldier. Fighting somebody else's war.
I turned in confusion, noting her intense expression as she spoke with an urgency in her voice.
Listen, Jacob, I'm only going to explain this once. We don't have time for malingerers, so you need to get your shit together and start pulling your weight. This is hell, and we are at war. Our leader is Minos, Hell's gatekeeper and former lieutenant to Lucifer. Minos long served as the recruiter for Satan's armies, but no more. He's risen up against the devil, and now all 9 circles are in bloody chaos. But Hell's politics don't mean a damn to us. We're doing what soldiers have always done. Fighting for our comrades and watching each other's backs.
I shook my head, breaking eye contact with the woman as I looked back at one of the severed heads, focusing upon his crazed eyes and watching as his dark pupils dilated. Am I going to end up like him? I whispered fearfully.
You might do.
Isabel answered with brutal honesty.
But that's the worst case scenario. Believe it or not, there's still a glimmer of hope for us. It's a long shot, but there's a way out.
I noticed the slightest sparks in Isabel's tired eyes, and it did give me hope. I wanted to ask more, but she cut me off before I could speak, saying,
You'll find out the details soon enough. But right now, we need to get back to the camp. We don't want to wait for Minos' enforcers to come looking for us. Believe me.
With that, she turned and started marching briskly down the hillside with Sebastian striding beside her. I took one last look at the mounted skulls before lowering my head in shame and disgust, and then I continued to follow my companions, realizing that they offered my best chance at survival in this deadly hellscape. I was sweating profusely by the time we descended the hill, as the temperature seemed to increase the closer we got to ground level. And the ground we walked upon was so hot that I could feel the soles of my feet burning even through the heavy boots I still wore. I thought about commenting on this to my companions, but soon reconsidered. Eventually, we reached a large camp located on the outskirts of a vast medieval city. I was not impressed by the ramshackle base, which consisted of a collection of dirty tents and a mob of poorly disciplined soldiers who all appeared unmotivated and exhausted. I observed the rabble who stood and sat amongst the tents, noting the dead and empty expressions upon their faces as they kept their heads firmly down. I noted how their often tattered uniforms were an odd mixture from throughout history, everything from tunics and bronze armor of Roman centurions to modern and camouflaged combat fatigues. I guessed that these men, and a few women, were soldiers who had fallen in battle throughout history before being dispatched here to hell. This gave me pause for thought. In the short time since my arrival in Dis, I'd had little opportunity to consider the circumstances of my death. I tried to think back, but found there was a gap in the memory. The likelihood is that I was killed instantly in combat, either in an IED attack or artillery bombardment. In a sense, it didn't really matter how I'd met my end. I knew it was only a matter of time until the war took my life. But why had I ended up here, in the depths of hell? I was raised in the church, but had long since turned my back on my faith. Even so, deep down, I think I always knew I was going to end up here. I tried to justify my heinous actions, repeating the much overused phrase, "bad things happen in war." Perhaps some of the lives I took were justified, soldiers killing soldiers in honorable combat. But then there were other killings, the shedding of innocent blood. My mind was taken back to that fateful day. the house burning fiercely while the tiny bodies lay on the grass in the foreground, their innocent, lifeless eyes staring up into the blue sky above. I shook myself out of that memory, and my body shuddered. I didn't wish to revisit that day, even if it meant facing the terrifying reality of the situation around me. Still, even in the midst of the mass of filthy, unwashed bodies and dead stares, there were fresh horrors to witness. I saw a substantial pit on the edge of the encampment and made the mistake of walking over to the edge and looking down. Inside of the long and deep pit were hundreds, perhaps thousands of broken bodies. Not dead, of course, but dismembered and mutilated beyond repair. Some were cut in half, their intestines hanging out in a grotesque display. Others were little more than severed heads, and many were missing limbs, but all appeared to be conscious of their horrific situation, staring up at me whilst moaning or pleading, all begging for a final release from their suffering, but I was powerless to help them. Isabel came up behind me, making me jump as she whispered in my ear,
Minos' rejects. Soldiers so badly wounded that they can no longer fight. The trench will be set alight in the coming hours. Their flesh burnt to ashes while their souls remain trapped here forever. That's what we're trying to avoid, Jacob.
She left me by the side of the trench as I attempted to process the horror. I noticed how the able-bodied soldiers avoided looking into the pit and did nothing to help their stricken former comrades. Perhaps it was predictable that hell was a cruel domain where compassion and mercy were all but non-existent. And before long, I followed the example of my companions, turning away from the pit and ignoring the pained moaning of the damned. The three of us soon joined a long line of soldiers waiting to be armed and equipped. After some time, we reached the top of the line, where a scarred-faced armorer with a black patch covering his missing right eye allocated us weapons and body armor without comment. I saw how Sebastian was given an ancient, bolt-loaded rifle which looked like it belonged in a museum, and Isabel received new bolts for her crossbow and a sharp bowie knife, and the armorer gave me a short sword and a circular shield. I looked at my allocated weaponry with bafflement after we were ushered away from the line. In life, I had been a 21st century soldier fighting with an assault rifle, shoulder-mounted missile launcher, or remote-controlled drone, but here in Dis, they expected me to fight with weapons that might have been used in the Battle of Troy. "What the hell is this?" I asked Isabel. She smirked before replying.
Look around you, Jacob.
I did so, noting how only about 1 in 5 soldiers carried firearms, most of them obsolete rifles and muskets. Most of the rest of the raging army were equipped with handheld weapons, swords, spears, and bows, and some of those present held no weapons whatsoever, and so were presumably expected to fight with their bare hands. I don't get it, I said while shaking my head.
Dis doesn't exactly have a thriving arms industry. And besides, why would Minos waste his best weapons on scum like us? We're cannon fodder, Jacob. Fit for nothing better than human wave attacks.
I looked into her eyes, hoping Isabel was joking, but my gaze was met by a stone-cold glare. Jesus, I swore in desperation. We're totally screwed.
Probably,
Isabel replied with a nod.
But this isn't our first rodeo. Stick with me and Sebastian, and you might just survive this.
I took little comfort from her words, but had little time to dwell on it, because a moment later, and the din of trumpets blared, drowning out every other sound. I didn't know what this meant, but soon saw thousands of soldiers suddenly standing up and marching towards the center of the camp. I followed the mob, and we soon reached the ruins of a Mayan-style pyramid located in the middle of a ramshackle military encampment. I saw an officer standing on top of the pyramid, a mustached commander who wore what appeared to be a Second World War Wehrmacht uniform. He cast his motionless eyes over us, the thousands of foot soldiers, as we assembled and stood awaiting his commands, but the general only spoke when the trumpet stopped.
Soldier of Dis!
He exclaimed in a booming voice which carried across the void.
Soldiers of Dis! Prepare to honor our glorious leader, Minos the Great, King of the Underworld, and Liberator of the 9 Circles!
A half-hearted cheer went up from the assembled crowd as the soldiers attempted to show some enthusiasm. Meanwhile, I stood in silent, shocked awe, watching as a giant emerged from beneath the ground and took its place atop the pyramid. The giant humanoid stood at least 20 feet tall, towering over the noticeably fearful German general who stood beside him. He took the form of a huge bearded man with cold, analytical eyes, but what drew my attention was the long and thin snake-like tail which wrapped around his body, giving Minos the appearance of a monstrous hybrid between man and serpent. I imagined he could use his vast snake tail to crush a human body, and the malice behind his eyes told me he wouldn't hesitate to do so. I noted how the entire crowd went silent as all looked up at Minos in terrified awe, all awaiting for our leader to speak. When he finally did so, his voice was booming and godlike, probably carrying for miles across the war-torn city.
My soldiers, my loyal followers, my children, our time has finally come. We have suffered thousands of years of oppression, cruelty, greed, and incompetent rule under the tyrant Lucifer. But no longer. Today, we begin our journey to liberation, to a new hell that we will reshape in our image. You brave men and women will play a central role in this battle. This company before me will have the honor of seizing the Iron Tower, Satan's final redoubt in our great city. Today, you heroic warriors will achieve a glorious victory, one which will seal your place in Hell's history for all eternity.
It was undoubtedly a rousing speech, but Minos' call to battle produced a lukewarm response from the assembled troops, as a few half-hearted cheers went up, but otherwise there was silence. It seemed that Minos' cause held little appeal to these damned foot soldiers. Nevertheless, our godlike leader seemed uncertain as he descended back into the ground, leaving his general to complete our pre-battle briefing. Although, as it turned out, the officer had little to say about the strategy or tactics.
All right, soldiers. Your orders are simple. Advance down the Street of Lost Souls and eliminate all opposition. Once you reach the Iron Tower, you'll need to fight your way inside and secure each level one at a time. But remember, whoever survives and secures the top floor will be rewarded with a second chance at life.
His final sentence evoked the enthusiasm which Minos' speech lacked, as thousands of soldiers cried out in excitement and joy at the prospect. When the shouting died down, I turned to Isabel in search of an explanation.
That's what we're fighting for. Fuck Minos and his crazy rebellion, and fuck Lucifer and this hell. If we make it to the top of that tower, we get reincarnated, sent back to Earth with a new body where we can start over. That's what every one of us desires more than anything.
I nodded my head as I finally understood. This war wasn't being fought for us, but it presented a once-in-eternity opportunity to escape from hell and return to the mortal plane where we could correct the mistakes we'd made during our first lives. This was a cause worth fighting for. With our orders delivered, our company surged forward, leaving the encampment and advancing into the city. In truth, we were more like a mob than a disciplined army, and I had no idea who was in command. Instead of an ordered advance, thousands of dead soldiers armed with an assortment of weapons piled down the narrow avenues and twisted alleyways of Dis, with the crimson sky above us and the sound of distant battles and disembodied screams in our ears. We continued our chaotic invasion despite the stifling heat until our disorganized force pushed through a barricade, climbing over the barriers and past a collection of bizarre orc-like creatures with thick, leathery skin. There were dozens of them in total, each one facing forwards and manning heavy machine guns aimed out towards a seemingly empty avenue. I glared suspiciously at the ugly and heavily armed creatures, whispering in Isabel's ear once we passed them. How come those freaks have heavy weapons? I swore the woman winced before she answered under her breath.
You'll see soon enough.
Shortly after crossing the barricade, we reached what I guessed was the aforementioned Street of Lost Souls. a wild avenue with tall stone houses on each side. I looked up to the darkened windows and high rooftops, soon realizing we were very vulnerable to ambush. But my comrades seemed unconcerned about the potential threat, and our advance continued unabated. At the far end of the long street was our objective, the so-called Iron Tower of Dis. The ugly metal structure dominated the skyline, towering above every building and casting a vast shadow over the vile street. I noted how the tower was surrounded by a high stone wall with thick metal gates that remained firmly shut. We had no siege weapons that I could see, so I was left to wonder how we would get inside. But this was a problem for later, because all hell was about to break loose on the street. I froze when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, turning in time to see a glimpse of a dark shadow darting across the rooftops above me. Soon there were others, their darkened figures appearing in the windows all around us. And then the first arrow was shot. Its tip set alight for deadly effect. I could only watch in impotent horror as the projectile struck the chest of a man in front of me and set his body on fire. The soldier screamed in agony as the flames engulfed him, and many more flaming arrows soon followed as shadowy archers emerged from the windows and rooftops, firing down upon us as if we were fish in a barrel. "Ambush!" came the cry. I cursed, taking no satisfaction from the fact that I'd predicted this development, instead wondering why this had been allowed to happen at all. Worse still, I had no means of fighting back and could only use my shield to parry the arrows whilst I took cover. I saw Isabel and Sebastian both drop down on one knee, cynically but effectively using the burning bodies of their comrades to cover as they returned fire towards the buildings. My eyes scanned the street as I witnessed multiple soldiers struck down, their bodies burning fiercely as they squirmed in total agony on the cobblestone streets. Some attempted to flee back towards the camp, and that's when the machine guns started firing, adding to the noisy chaos as they cut down the retreating troops. It seemed this was the purpose of the orcish monsters we'd observed at the barricade. Their ruthless elimination of the deserters meant we had only two choices: stand and die, or fight our way forward. I acted quickly, staying low as I grabbed a discarded rifle from the road, loading it and joining my comrades as I fired upon the upper windows. Our force took horrific casualties, but by sheer strength of numbers, we succeeded in fending off the attack, firing upon the archers until they all either fell or withdrew. I breathed a sigh of relief, but there was little to celebrate, as dozens were either burnt to a crisp or riddled with arrows. Either way, there was nothing we could do for them now, and so we ignored their screams and moved on. The advance was more cautious now, as the survivors of the first attack were understandably paranoid, glancing up at the stone houses on either side as we expected a further assault at any moment. We'd marched for a few hundred yards, leaving the carnage and screaming soldiers behind us as we approached the fortifications surrounding the Iron Tower. The approach seemed a little too easy, but inevitably we were walking into yet another trap, although not one I could have predicted.
Heads up! Harpy attack incoming!
Isabel suddenly cried. In a panic, I looked up into the blood-red sky in time to see dozens of black dots soaring through the air, winged creatures growing larger as they descended upon us, our ears filled with the high-pitched shrieking of the hellish beasts. I saw the first wave just moments before their aerial assault. Bright red, winged demons with long and sharp claws, crocodile-like teeth, surely capable of chomping through flesh. I raised my rifle, targeting the first attacker in my gun's sight and noting the predatory glare in its burning eyes. Then I fired, feeling the kickback against my shoulder. A split second later, and my bullet hit its mark, striking the winged beast in its torso and knocking it out of the air. I had little time to celebrate this small victory, however, as dozens more of these murderous harpies descended upon our company in a lightning assault. Some were shot from the air, while others got cut down with spears and swords, but many more reached our lines, literally tearing into our troops in a savage attack. I tried in vain to maintain my rate of fire until my ammunition inevitably ran out. Then I could do little but watch as the massacre played out. I saw men decapitated, lifted into the air, and torn in half by fighting harpies, their screams filling the air and blood pouring down the street. Joining the survivors, I hurried toward the fortifications ahead of us, reuniting with Isabel and Sebastian as we organized a desperate last stand.
We need to get to the other side of that wall. Otherwise, we're dead meat.
Sebastian shouted. The gate's locked. What chance do we have?
Just wait.
Isabel replied while she simultaneously took out an attacking harpy with a crossbow bolt.
Minos has one more trick up his sleeve.
I wondered what she meant, but the answer soon became apparent. On the far horizon, beyond the flight of bloodthirsty harpies and their desperate victims, appeared 1, 2, and then 3 balls of flame rapidly heading in our direction as if guided by some unseen force.
Get down!
Isabel screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. Hitting the ground alongside my comrades as the fireballs whizzed over our heads. A wave of heat and debris swept over us, and the smell of burning flesh and metal hit my nostrils. Once the attack was over, I lifted my head and waited for the dust to settle before observing the scene of carnage. The fireball attack had destroyed the gate, melting the iron and creating a hole large enough for a small army to march through. Meanwhile, every being in the immediate vicinity had become collateral damage, with damned souls and harpies both burnt to ashes throughout the kill zone. My God, I exclaimed as I slowly got to my feet. Isabel and Sebastian had survived, but many others hadn't. I saw broken and charred bodies strewn across the street. Many were beyond help. In fact, I estimated we'd lost at least half of our soldiers, with many of the survivors having severe injuries or agonizing burns. But everyone who could still walk would keep going, because they knew what the alternative was. As for the harpies, many of their number had been burnt alive, while the survivors fled back into the blood-red skies. I shook my head, looking to the melted gate and the dominating tower beyond. This was our objective, and a great prize awaited whoever could make it to the top, but I felt a cold foreboding as I looked up at the cold, dark metal structure, sensing that a great evil dwelt inside. Isabel surely picked up on my apprehension, walking over to my side and placing a firm hand on my shoulder.
It's fucking terrifying, isn't
I
it?
shook my head, not quite knowing how to respond. I thought it would be better defended. I eventually said,
It doesn't need to be. The true terror of the Iron Tower lies within its walls.
I turned to face her, seeing a fear in her eyes that I hadn't witnessed before. Next, I looked to the ever-silent Sebastian, but even his hard exterior seemed to melt away in the shadow of this vile structure. I took a deep breath before asking my next question. We fought against monsters and survived. What more can they throw at us? Isabel scoffed before replying.
You have no idea, Jacob. Hell isn't all demons, zombies, and monsters. The true horror is in here. The tower is like a living entity. It has the power to delve into your soul, to dig out all the darkness, all the primal terrors buried deep within your psyche. It might sound like a cliche, but all your worst nightmares will come true once you step inside. That's the dark magic of the Iron Tower. The evil we must fight to get home.
I glanced back at the wicked structure, creaking my head so I could see all the way up to the ugly spire at its summit. I didn't wish to look upon the tower, as the mere sight provoked a sickening terror within me, but yet I couldn't avert my gaze as I stood frozen on the burning, blood-stained cobblestones.
Let me tell you something, Jacob. Sebastian and me, we've been down this road many times. This isn't the first time we fought our way down this street, but we've always chickened out at the last moment. Not this time, though. Right, Sebastian?
No, not this time.
The two of us have made a pact. We can't stay in Dis any longer. It doesn't matter what horrors we'll face or that our odds of survival are low. We're going into the tower and taking our chances.
She paused, pointing back at the host of soldiers standing behind us.
I don't expect many volunteers from this lot. Most don't have the balls to go through with it. But you, Jacob, I'm taking a leap of faith here. But I think you might have the stomach for this fight. Sebastian and I could sure use a good soldier like you to watch our backs. Still, it's your choice, my friend. Either you stay here in Dis and spend all eternity fighting Minos' war, or you come with us and take a chance at winning your freedom. So, what do you say, Jacob?
I heard the vulnerability in her voice and realized she was terrified of what lay ahead. This didn't bode well, and my instincts told me to run for the hills, but where could I go? I looked back towards the company of dead soldiers and the scene of suffering, devastation, and bloodshed on the street beyond. Looking further, I saw the war-torn city, noting the screams, the howls, and the many fires burning through the ruins of Dis. On the far horizon, I could make out the harbor of dark water, watching as yet another giant demon emerged from below the surface, roaring as it stomped through the shallows and assaulted the shoreline. I came to a stark realization in that moment. I didn't want to stay in this circle of hell. I couldn't stay here. The Iron Tower promised psychological tortures that I could not imagine, but if there was even a slim chance at making it home, I had to take it. Turning back to face my companions, I nodded firmly and said, "I'll do it. I'm with you guys." Isabel's tired face lit up, and even Sebastian managed to half smile.
Good boy.
Isabel replied before pointing towards the destroyed gate.
Well, gentlemen, there's no time like the present.
Taking a deep breath and dismissing my fears, I took a step forward alongside my comrades. We slowly and cautiously approached the smoldering remains of the iron gate, but developments on the street added an extra impetus. We all heard the thunderous roar from above, looking up to see an alpha predator emerging from the clouds, a winged monster which dwarfed the fleeing harpies in size and ferocity.
Oh God! It's him!
I watched for a moment in awe-struck horror, observing a huge jet-black dragon rapidly descending upon us, its red eyes burning with pure hatred as its vast wings flapped furiously.
Run, damn it!
I paused for only a moment, watching as the dark dragon spat out a stream of blue fire, engulfing the company of soldiers who stood behind us, their flesh burning as their agonizing screams filled the air. I turned and ran for all my worth, joining Sebastian and Isabel as we sprinted through the demolished gate, and the dragon's horrific roar rang in our ears. Charging across the courtyard, we frantically searched for an entrance into the tower. There wasn't a door as such, but rather a swirling vortex of black and red at the tower's base. The portal was far from inviting, but it was our only chance to escape from the winged monstrosity pursuing us. So, the three of us ran towards it, Sebastian jumping through first as his body disappeared into the vortex. Isabel followed a second later, leaving me alone on the killing field. The huge dragon was right above me now, its hideous roar deafening me as I smelt the foul stench of burnt flesh from its gaping maw. Next came the fire, a stream of napalm which set the ground behind me alight. My clothes were burnt, my skin was singed. The portal entrance was only mere feet away, but I didn't think I'd make it. I drew every last ounce of strength from my exhausted body, fighting through the pain and fear as I screamed and jumped. I hit the vortex mere seconds before the fire, my body being sucked into oblivion as the darkness consumed me. I must have lost consciousness for a time, because I awoke in a dark and evil place, violently thrust into the next chapter of this hellish odyssey. It took a while for the circumstances of my death to come back to me. The memory was thrust back into my conscious mind during our descent into a swirling vortex at the base of the Iron Tower, as my companions and I escaped from one hellscape only to be plunged into another. The end of my mortal life came during one wet and miserable afternoon on a war-torn battlefield in Eastern Europe. At the time, my platoon was deployed along a supposedly quiet section of the front, and I guess I got complacent. I recall being soaked to the skin as I trudged through the mud and scanned the gray horizon. I took a step and heard a sudden ominous click underneath my boot. A cold terror ran through my veins as my brain just had enough time to process what had just occurred. A second later, the landmine I'd unwittingly stepped upon detonated. My last conscious feeling was one of intense heat, and then I was blown to Kingdom Come. And the next thing I remembered was waking up in hell, thrust into yet another bloody war, although in this realm, the battles are fought between demons and the damned souls rather than human soldiers and their high-tech weapons. What can I say about Dis? The ugly and war-torn city where they sent me. The fifth circle is violence, and Dis is its capital. This is where most dead soldiers and generals end up. That's not to say there aren't honorable soldiers who fight for righteous causes, but the old saying is true. War is hell. The bloodshed and violence changes a man. It corrupts his soul and forces the mark of Cain upon him, and in the end, few, if any, escape unscathed. You can't die in hell, but you can suffer. They can blow your body apart, chop your head off your shoulders, but the suffering never ends. When I awoke in the afterlife, I was instantly confronted with the true horrors of Dis, experiencing the foul stench of death, seeing the medieval city burn under the flames of 1,000 fires, and witnessing the towering demons and bloodthirsty harpies tearing lost souls to shreds. I suppose I should count myself lucky that I met 2 Dis veterans who took me under their wing. I knew little about Sebastian and Elizabeth, 2 damned souls who died in past wars before being dropped into the terror-filled streets of Dis. It was Isabel, the mysterious Amazon-like warrior, who explained the origins of this conflict. Minos was the gatekeeper of Hell and the former recruiter of Satan's army, but the serpent-like demon had revolted against Lucifer in an attempt to take control of the underworld in 9 circles. We were conscript in Minos' ramshackle army, essentially serving as cannon fodder in the vicious cycle for control of Dis. The press gang souls we served alongside had little loyalty to Minos or his cause. They fought for one reason only: the chance of freedom. Our demonic overlord had made a promise to his soldiers. More than anything, Minos wanted control over the Iron Tower, the tall and dominating monolith which was the key to the entire 5th circle. If we could capture the tower and reach its summit, our master would give us a second chance at life and facilitate our return to the mortal plane. As far as we were concerned, this was a prize worth fighting for. But, of course, there was a price to pay, and it was a heavy one. The 3 of us literally leapt into the vortex which marked the entrance to the Iron Tower as our former comrades burnt in an unholy fire behind us. I must have lost consciousness during the chaotic transition because I awoke on a cold floor within a dark, windowless chamber, dimly lit by torches burning on the black and featureless walls. My companions were standing above me, Sebastian with his huge bulking frame blocking out the dim light, remaining silent as always as he looked down upon me with piercing eyes. To his right was Isabel, a thin smile on her dry lips as she no doubt planned to say something clever and sarcastic. The woman exerted confidence, on the surface at least, but in reality, I could see fear behind her wide eyes. Sebastian offered me a hand and helped me to my feet, while Isabel whispered in my ear,
Welcome to the Iron Tower, Jacob. Now the real fun begins.
I ignored her attempt at humor as I surveyed our grim surroundings. The darkened chamber was small and tight, appearing to be an entryway to whatever lay inside the twisted tower. I noted the steel doors ahead of us, marked by strange and disturbing symbols. From the other side of the door, we could hear muffled sounds of a deep voice which seemed to be leading some kind of prayer. The heavy door was shut, and I didn't want to imagine what was occurring in the next room, but the door was the only way out of the chamber we currently occupied, and we had to move forward. All 3 of us were experienced warriors, but we'd expended the ammunition for our firearms and crossbow during the fighting out in the street, and so only carried bladed weapons. Once I was on my feet, I stood shoulder to shoulder with my companions, sharing a look of steadfast determination as we stepped forward together.
We stand and fight together, no matter what,
said Isabel as she reached out for the ivory handle and slowly pushed the heavy door open. We entered a large chamber, still dimly lit and consisting of 4 windowless walls of cold iron. Although I noted the walls were adorned with hellish imagery, crude images of demons and monsters which appeared to be painted in blood. In the center of the vast chamber stood a group of humanoid figures dressed in dark red robes and with inverted crosses hanging from their necks. They had hoods covering their heads, and I couldn't see their faces in the darkness, but I noted how they were standing in a circle around a blood-red pentagram painted upon the metal floor. Behind the circle of robed cultists was a white altar, which appeared to be constructed from assorted bones and skulls, and upon the altar stood who I assumed was the cult's leader, a tall, thin, and bald man with ghostly pale skin and intense, bug-like eyes. He initially ignored our presence in his chamber as the 3 of us simply stood in the doorway, watching and listening as whatever twisted ceremony they were performing proceeded unopposed. When the cult leader spoke, his voice was high-pitched and chilling.
Disciples of the Dark Lord, we face a great challenge at this time. War has come to our Lord's unholy kingdom, and the arch-traitor is laying siege to our most twisted and wretched stronghold. But we will not abandon our faith, even as the most horrid beams of light invade our darkest places. We, the loyal servants of Lucifer, must stand tall and make the sacrifices we need to obtain victory.
He paused, turning his head and shouting to yet unseen cultists behind him.
Guards, bring out the prisoner.
We continued to watch in shock and awe as a pair of robed cultists emerged from the shadows, dragging a naked and emaciated prisoner along the ground behind them. Once they came closer, I noticed how their prisoner bore the signs of torture on his damaged body, with deep scars and broken bones clearly visible. I also noted how he didn't fight or scream as they dragged him out. I guess the poor bastard was so beaten down and defeated that he could no longer resist. I was sickened by the display and instinctively stepped forward to intervene, but it was Sebastian who stopped me as he placed a firm hand on my arm and shook his head as a warning. The pair of cultists dragged their victim into the center of a pentagram, unceremoniously dumping his frail body onto the cold metal floor before joining the circle of cultists which surrounded him.
Our Lord of Darkness, we offer this sacrifice in humility and fear. May his impure blood give you strength to crush your enemies and restore your absolute power over the 9 circles.
The naked man in the circle looked up in that moment. His bloodshot eyes filled with terror as he desperately searched for any chance to escape, but he found none. A moment later, and all the cultists simultaneously withdrew daggers from beneath their robes as they advanced menacingly towards their intended victim. The man screamed and tried to get up on his feet to fight, but he was too weak and soon overwhelmed. I grimaced as we watched the cultists repeatedly stab their defenseless victim. My ears were filled with the sickening sound of blades cutting through flesh and the muffled screams of their victim, his agonizing cries growing ever weaker as he slowly gave up the fight. The blood flowed across the metal floor, and I swore I could see the pentagram burning like it was absorbing the victim's life force. But the tortured soul could not die. This was hell, after all, and he was condemned to suffer here for all eternity. His body was a bloody mess by the time the cultists ended their savage attack and withdrew their blood-stained knives. The unfortunate victim continued to whimper on the cold floor, bleeding from dozens of deep stab wounds and begging for his agony to end. And then, the pale-faced cult leader spoke, his chilling voice echoing throughout the iron chamber.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Let it be so.
With that, he raised his bony hand above his head and evoked some kind of black magic, summoning fire as if from thin air. My companions and I looked on in awestruck horror as a fireball was formed, a burning orb which hovered over the cultist's head before he thrust it forward with a mere swipe of his left hand, and suddenly the fireball soared through the air and hit the helpless victim, engulfing his broken body in unholy fire. The man screamed one last time before his body was burnt away, dissolving into ashes in front of our eyes. With the sacrifice made, the pentagram was consumed by a circle of white flames which burnt fiercely as Lucifer apparently absorbed the victim's soul. And even though his physical body was reduced to cinders, we could still hear the victim's disembodied screams echoing throughout the chamber, as his eternal suffering had surely reached a whole new level of savage horror. I shuddered over what I'd witnessed. That's not to say I wasn't familiar with acts of violence. I'd seen and participated in many such acts during my military career, but the normalization of the cruelty and savagery in hell was beyond anything I'd previously been subjected to. I continued to stare in mesmerized horror at the burning pentagram until I was shaken back to reality by Isabel.
We need to keep moving. We can't stay here.
I nodded my head in agreement, as did Sebastian. The 3 of us moved forward cautiously, keeping our bladed weapons to hand in case we needed to fight our way through, but we were seriously outnumbered. I counted a dozen red-robed cultists in total, 13 if you counted their leader. I didn't fancy our chances if it came to a stand-up fight, and so we planned to sneak past the cultists in the slim hope that they wouldn't notice our presence. But, of course, we weren't so lucky. In an instant, the dozen cult members turned their backs on the fire as they all faced in our direction. I still couldn't see their faces, which remained hidden under their hoods, but we could see their hideous eyes, burning red with a fiery intensity. Whatever these things were, they definitely weren't human. The daggers emerged next as all 12 cultists withdrew their still blood-soaked daggers and pointed them menacingly in our direction. The 3 of us formed a defensive line and prepared to fight as the armed cultists slowly advanced upon us. But to our immense surprise, their leader intervened as he called out to his bloodthirsty followers.
Do not attack. Let them pass. Their souls belong to the Dark Lord, and only He can decide their fate.
His words chilled me to my bones even after the cultists wordlessly obeyed their leader's orders. Withdrawing their daggers and standing aside to let him pass, We moved forward cautiously, keeping our weapons handy as we prepared for the possibility of a double cross. There was a second door on the far side of the chamber, which appeared to be the only way out of the room. None of the cultists attempted to stop our progress as we made our way past the scene of the brutal sacrifice, but to get to the door, we needed to pass the altar where the pale-faced warlock stood. His cold eyes followed us closely as we walked. I thought he'd keep his promise and let us go, but suddenly the warlock shot forward at incredible speed, heading straight for me and grabbing hold of my body before I got a chance to resist. He knocked the blade out of my hand with ease before taking a firm hold, pulling me so close as I was forced to look into his cold eyes and felt his icy breath against my skin.
Let him go!
Isabel screamed, and she held her knife up to his throat. But the warlock didn't even seem to notice as he continued to stare right into my eyes. I shook uncontrollably in his tight grasp as he spoke his chilling words into my ear. But to my surprise, he delivered what sounded more like a warning than a threat.
You are entering a hell beyond your worst nightmares, and will be forced to face the darkest corners of your own psyche. You cannot trust anyone or anything. And remember one thing, Jacob. Evil begins in the heart, as impure blood is pumped through the arteries and corrupts the body. To defeat evil, you must eliminate the source.
I didn't understand what the warlock meant, but was relieved when he released me from his icy grip.
Go now,
he said as I returned to my comrades.
Proceed to the next level.
I led the way, still shaken by the encounter with the ghoulish entity. I placed my hand on the ivory handle and experienced a chilling foreboding as I opened the heavy door, which allowed us to proceed to the next area. What we found behind the next doorway was a narrow spiral staircase leading upwards. It was similar to what we would find inside a medieval castle, except that the steps were forged from iron rather than carved from stone. None of us liked it. The stairs were so narrow that we could only proceed one at a time, and we couldn't see around corners, which meant we could be ambushed at any point. The staircase seemed like a death trap, but what choice did we have? None of us wished to return to the previous chamber to face those bloodthirsty cultists and their demonic leader, so after a short discussion, we decided to ascend. Sebastian led the way up the spiral stairs. He was the strongest, and so best placed to defend our small party from a sudden attack. Meanwhile, Isabel walked in the middle while I took up the rear. I don't know how many steps we climbed in our ascent. I lost count. All I know is that I was soon exhausted and disorientated. I think my companions were also tired and frustrated, and we weren't fully alert when the attack finally came. Sebastian let out a sharp cry, raising his machete to counter the swing of his enemy's blade. I heard the distinctive sound of steel striking steel and saw what looked like a medieval knight on the staircase attacking Sebastian with a short sword. The attacker wore a full suit of black armor with an inverted cross emblazoned on his chest plate. He wore a helmet which covered his face, but I could see his eyes through the visor, eyes which burnt a demonic red. He screeched like a banshee as he swung his sword, and Sebastian struggled to defend himself as he desperately parried the attacks. Unfortunately, both Isabel and I were unable to help our comrade because the staircase was too narrow, but I would have problems of my own before too long. I heard the heavy stomping of footsteps behind me, turning just in time to confront a second attacker. Yet another dark knight charged up the stairs toward me. He was clad in the same black armor and seemed identical to the first attacker. His red eyes burned with fiery intensity, and he let out a hellish wail before thrashing out with his sword. I reacted on instinct, using my own blade to block the attacker's sword, but the sheer force of the attack knocked me off my feet, and I tripped on the steps. The fiendish knight continued his assault, attacking with his blade as he struggled to parry the hard blows. I don't know if I would have lasted much longer, but thankfully Isabel came to my rescue. I remained on the ground as she thrust out her knife, stabbing the knife in his throat after expertly finding the gap between his body armor and helmet. A moment later, Isabel kicked out and sent the knight tumbling down the metal staircase. While this was happening, Sebastian gained the upper hand over the first knight, using his machete to saw through the enemy's neck. Our comrade made good use of his brute strength and cut through the flesh and bone until he severed the knight's head completely. Next, Sebastian calmly lifted the severed head and held it aloft. To my horror, I noticed how the knight's red eyes were still burning as they looked down upon us, but Sebastian wasted no time before he tossed the head down the stairs, and it bounced off the iron steps before disappearing from sight. Jesus Christ! I swore in shock after the savage assault.
Jesus didn't save your ass. I did,
Was Isabel's cynical reply.
Now get back on your feet, soldier.
I nodded my head as I got back up to my feet and lifted my blade. Isabel's warning was clear to me. I knew both she and Sebastian were determined to reach the tower's summit, and they wouldn't hesitate to leave me behind if I slowed them down. The last thing I wanted was to be left alone in this hellscape to face the horrors which inhabited it. We proceeded up the staircase, stepping over the knight's beheaded body whilst Isabel took his sword. We didn't know where the steps would end and expected a further ambush at any moment, but miraculously, we soon reached the top of the staircase and were confronted by yet another steel door with an ivory handle. Both Isabel and I held back, staring at each other as if we shared a mutual feeling of dread at whatever lay on the far side. But it was Sebastian who stepped forward, placing his huge but now shaking hand upon the ivory before he slowly pushed the door open. We entered yet another dark chamber, dimly lit by torches and seemingly empty at first glance, although I noticed the foul stench emanating from inside. The chamber stank of rotting flesh and something even fouler, which certainly didn't bode well. Sebastian walked out first, and it quickly became apparent that something wasn't right. His heavy boots didn't march upon solid iron as we would have expected. Instead, his feet sank into wet mud, which apparently covered the entire floor within this last hellish chamber. Sebastian looked up at us with anxious concern in his dark eyes. He'd sunk a few inches into the mud, and it was clear that our progress through this level would be slow and difficult. Nevertheless, we had to keep moving forward, no matter how tough our journey became. Isabel and I soon followed in Sebastian's footsteps and stepped into the inexplicable field of mud. We sludged through, struggling with each step as the mud hampered our progress. I could see the next doorway at the far end of the chamber, but this was a large room, and it would surely take us a long time to make it across. Still trekking through the mud wasn't the worst horror I could imagine, but of course, the hellish chamber had yet another nasty surprise in store for us. I think I was the first to see it. A figure or creature emerging from the mud in front of us, digging its way to the surface and slowly crawling towards us. I shouted out a warning and pointed in that direction, but soon more creatures emerged from underneath the muddy surface, all heading towards us. It was only when the creatures got close that I realized these entities were people, or at least they'd once been. Mud covered their faces and bodies, but I could just make out their tattered uniforms underneath the grime and dirt. Their eyes were filled with madness and hunger, and their bodies were broken almost beyond recognition. Most were missing at least one leg, and none were able to stand upon the muddy ground, but they used whatever limbs they had left to crawl and push themselves forward. I counted at least 24, with more coming up to the surface with every passing moment.
Shit! We've got to move.
Sebastian was the furthest forward of our trio, and so led the fight. He tried to wade his way past the now moaning lost souls, but they grabbed and clawed at his legs and attempted to drag him down. Our comrade reacted with predictable violence, crushing skulls underfoot and slicing off their limbs and heads with his machete. It wasn't long before the ravenous souls reached me and Isabel, and we were forced to join the fight. The first living corpse attempted to bite my ankle before I brought my blade down, burying it in its skull. From that point onwards, I acted like a berserker, thrashing out and slaying zombie after zombie as I slowly fought my way forward towards the door and the only exit. All three of us were fighting like hell, but we were seriously outnumbered. I glanced to my left and saw Isabel was in trouble, as half a dozen zombies had surrounded her. She cried out as the creatures clawed at her legs and started to pull her down into the mud. I moved towards her, wailing like a maniac as I started hacking and kicking. Before long, I'd slayed all the attackers, cutting their rotting bodies into pieces. I helped Isabel back onto her feet, and she shot me a smile whilst mouthing, "Thank you." I felt satisfied because I'd returned the favor and proved my worth, but we were still in significant danger. We continued the slow, desperate fight, trudging through the mud whilst hacking our attackers up with our blades. The battle was tough and exhausting, but the three of us so nearly made it. Isabel and I managed to fight our way to the next door, but Sebastian lagged behind. I hadn't noticed during the violent chaos, but he seemed to be the main target of the legless zombies, as if they had a personal vendetta against him. We saw him about 10 yards behind us, desperately fighting against a host of the undead. They groaned and snarled in hungry anticipation while grasping their victim's legs and biting into his flesh. Sebastian roared in fury and fought back with all his might, but there was too many for him. I wanted to go back and go to the aid of my stricken comrade, but Isabel stopped me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder and saying,
It's too late, Jacob.
And sadly, she was right. Soon Sebastian's strength failed, and the scrum of mud-caked bodies pulled him downwards. Our comrades dropped his machete and stopped fighting. It seemed he'd now accepted his fate. Sebastian looked towards us in the last moment, his eyes emotionless and his mouth firmly shut. I wanted to say something comforting to him, but couldn't find the words, and a moment later, our comrade was pulled under the surface, his head disappearing into the mud as the old soldier faced an uncertain but surely horrific fate. I stood watching the now empty field of mud for a long moment before Isabel once again touched my shoulder. I turned to face my female companion and saw nothing but a steely determination in her eyes as she said,
We need to keep going. We've sacrificed too much to give up now.
I nodded my head in silent agreement before placing my hand on the ivory handle and pushing the door open. Isabel and I both cried out in despair when we cast our eyes upon yet another spiral staircase leading upwards. I began to lose hope at this point, fearing that there was no escape from this dreaded iron tower, only suffering and torture throughout our endless descent. Sebastian was gone now. We didn't speak his name or even verbally acknowledge his demise. I realized our ill-fated companion wasn't at peace. Instead, he'd surely been dragged to a deeper and darker circle of hell where he'd be subjected to even worse torment. This would surely be our fate too, if or when we fail. I felt like dropping to my knees and screaming in despair, but I couldn't show such weakness in front of Isabel. After a short pause, we proceeded up the staircase. Isabel led the way while I followed. It seemed to make little difference, however, because an attack could come from ahead or behind. We proceeded slowly with extreme caution, expecting to be assaulted by demonic knights at any moment. But when the attack eventually came, it was in a most unexpected form. I suddenly heard a low hissing from behind, turning to see a red serpent slithering up the stairs towards me. The snake was almost 2 feet in length, its reptilian eyes staring straight at me with predatory zeal as it continued to hiss aggressively and showed its sharp fangs. I shouted out a warning to Isabel before thrashing out with my blade and cutting the serpent in two. My victory was short-lived, however, as a moment later I was assaulted by a host of multicolored snakes which slithered over each other and up the staircase. The foul hissing was now near deafening, and I saw venom dripping from their fangs as their yellow eyes focused upon me. Isabel could not help because the staircase was too narrow for 2 people to fight side by side, and so I had to defend myself, desperately lashing out with my blade in a righteous fury. I culled snake after snake in a frenzied battle, and soon the steps were covered in their blood and guts, as the severed snake bodies continued to squirm and slither in a macabre display. I thought I had the vermin beaten, but one plucky serpent managed to get through my defenses and launch a vicious attack before I could react. The creature plunged its fangs deep into my flesh, causing me to scream in agony as I thrashed out to chop the snake in half. Next, I fell onto the steps as I grabbed hold of the serpent's head and tore it from my flesh, prompting another spike of pain. Fearfully, I looked down at the ghastly bite wound in my leg and soon felt nauseous. I swore I could feel the serpent's poison coursing through my veins, slowly corrupting every part of my body and inducing a horrific pain within me. I screamed again as my brain struggled to process the agony, and for a moment I thought I'd black out. But in an instant, Isabel was at my side, shaking me vigorously before slapping me hard across the face.
Damn it, Jacob! The venom can't kill you. You know this! It's going to hurt like hell, but you can't lose consciousness. Believe me, you don't want to give up now. You'll regret it for all eternity.
I listened to her advice, somehow managing to stay conscious and get up on my shaking feet. My bad leg was going numb, and so Isabel had to support me as we struggled up the remaining steps before reaching the next door of cold steel. The chamber we entered was unremarkable at first glance. It was dimly lit and typically austere and featureless, but at least my nostrils weren't assaulted by a foul stench, and when we walked on the ground it was solid. I was still in great pain, however, so not fully aware of my surroundings or the potential threats within. Stumbling forward, I failed to notice Isabel's sudden change in demeanor as she no longer retained her tough and confident persona and instead took on an uncharacteristic vulnerability. She let go of me and slowly walked toward the center of the dark chamber. I wonder what was drawing her until suddenly an inexplicable vision materialized in front of me. I thought I was hallucinating at first, but clearly Isabel saw it too, as she slowly proceeded toward the scene. What we saw was a representation of a child's bedroom, complete with a bed, cuddle toys, and cheap plywood furniture. The room looked entirely out of place in this hellish chamber, as did the young girl who sat upon the bed, humming to herself as she combed her doll's hair. The kid could only have been 8 or 9, her dark hair hanging long and her hazel eyes shining with a childish innocence. The girl looked familiar to me, but I couldn't quite place her. She was obviously entirely oblivious to our presence, like we were outsiders secretly observing her private world. I felt very uncomfortable and unsettled, but noticed how my companion had become emotional, with tears openly rolling down her rosy cheeks as she watched the scene intently. And then, all of a sudden, the bedroom door was violently kicked open and a thuggish figure burst inside. The man looked huge to the little girl, his muscles bulging and face burning a bright red. I saw the thug clenching his fists as he screamed at the girl with a frightening fury.
God damn it, Belle. Didn't I tell you not to leave your bike in the driveway?
The girl was clearly terrified as she jumped off the bed and cowered in the corner whilst whimpering.
I'm sorry, Daddy.
But his anger didn't diminish as he charged forward and grabbed her.
I'm so sick of this shit.
He roared before striking his daughter hard around the head. She cried out in pain, but this didn't stop the animal from hitting her again. Finally, the abusive father ended his sickening assault, leaving his innocent daughter bleeding on the bedroom floor as he stormed out of the room and slammed the door shut behind him. The scene was sickening and disturbing, even compared to the horrors I'd already witnessed. Nevertheless, I didn't understand why the tower was showing this to us, but I soon got my answer. The girl continued to cry whilst rolling up in a ball on the floor, but suddenly a new voice could be heard. A disembodied, unnaturally deep, and decidedly inhuman voice which chilled my very soul.
It's not going to stop, you know. Not unless we stop him.
To my surprise, the girl responded as if she recognized the invisible entity speaking to her through the walls.
I told you to leave me alone. I don't want you here.
No more games, Belle. You know what must be done.
He's my daddy.
He'll keep hurting you. Only I can stop him. I am your last friend, Belle. The only one who can protect you. And I will save you, my child. If only you ask. I'll keep you safe forever. And all I ask in return is your love and loyalty.
Those last words chilled me, and it seemed like an eternity passed before the girl finally answered, whispering her one-word answer just loud enough to be heard.
Okay.
With that, the image of the child's bedroom disappeared into thin air, and we were alone once more. I looked to Isabel as she glared back at me, her reddening eyes now focused like those of a deadly predator. And suddenly it all came together inside of my confused brain. Isabel was Belle, and we'd just witnessed a memory from her violent past. She'd made a deal with something evil to escape from her abusive father, but now there was a price to be paid. The temperature in the chamber suddenly dropped to freezing, and Isabel's hard stare cut through me as she spoke slowly and carefully in a cold tone.
So, now you know.
She began. My jaw dropped as I struggled to find the words to reply. What did you do, Isabel? I asked fearfully. I noticed how her hand was poised on the grip of her sword as she explained.
The Dark Lord saved me from that abusive asshole. He gave me my life back, and I've served him ever since. They used to call me the Angel of Death. Did you know that? I was a sniper, the best in the business. How many souls did I send down to my master? Honestly, I stopped counting after I reached double figures. Send them all to hell. That was my motto. I served Lucifer well in the mortal realm, right up until the day they dropped a 1,000-pound bomb on my head.
I shook my head, hardly believing what I was hearing. I don't understand. I blurted out, "You fought for Minos, not for Lucifer. You recruited me into this rebel army." She smiled cruelly before replying,
I was never loyal to Minos. The Dark Lord sent me to infiltrate his forces and act as a spy within the traitor's army. I performed this task to the best of my abilities, but what I really excel at is sending fresh souls to the Ninth Circle.
She paused momentarily before delivering the killer line.
That's where you come in, Jacob.
I noticed how she started walking slowly towards me with her blade drawn. Sensing the threat, I started to back off whilst reaching for my own weapon. "Why?" I asked in confusion. "Why me?" She shrugged her shoulders whilst continuing her menacing approach.
Don't ask me. I'm just following orders. Lucifer wants you, Jacob. I guess he sees potential in you. But take my advice. Don't resist. This will all go a lot easier if you just let it happen.
She smiled thinly, her eyes gradually changing color to blood red as she raised her sword to attack, but my heart was filled with defiance. Isabel had betrayed me, but I had no intention of going down without a fight, nor would I ever willingly serve the devil. I was still suffering from the snake's venom, and so was in a weakened state, but nevertheless, a surge of adrenaline pumped through my corrupted veins as I launched a preemptive strike, thrashing out with my blade in an attempt to slice Isabel in two. She parried my blade, but this didn't deter me. Using my last reserves of strength, I struck again, this time slicing Isabel deep across her chest. But to my horror, she hardly seemed to notice the wound. Instead, my opponent merely laughed sadistically, her red eyes burning bright as she launched a retaliatory attack. Deftly and precisely using her sword to test my defenses, I managed to block her first few attacks, but then she went low and cut my thigh. I screamed in pain and stumbled backwards. Isabel laughed again and she went in for the kill. I was weak and in a lot of pain, and I realized I wouldn't last much longer. But strangely, at this moment, the cryptic advice of the warlock came back to me.
Trust no one. Corruption comes from the heart. Destroy the source.
Isabel clearly no longer considered me a threat as she raised her sword and prepared to cut my head off. I knew I only had one chance, and so took a deep breath and made my move, thrusting my blade deep into Isabel's exposed chest. By luck or skill, I struck the right spot, the force of my thrust penetrating her ribcage and plunging straight into her heart. Isabel didn't seem to acknowledge the injury at first, as she looked down at her wound in confusion. But suddenly she cried out blue murder, the red in her eyes fading as her body literally fell apart and dissolved into ashes in front of my very eyes. I stood in shock for a moment, hardly able to believe what I'd just witnessed. I reckoned Isabel was now with her master in whatever hellscape he called home. The devil would surely punish my former companion for her failure to capture my soul, but this wasn't my problem. I did wonder whether everything she told me was a lie. Perhaps there was no way out of the tower, and I would never escape this vile place. Nevertheless, I had to try, even if there was only the slimmest chance of freedom. I was a wreck by this point, my legs sliced open and the serpent's poison still spreading through my system, but I wouldn't give up, finding reserves that I never knew I had as I limped through the chamber, opened the next door, and practically crawled up another staircase to reach the final room where I would be forced to face my personal demons head-on. As I pushed through the heavy door, I stumbled into a chamber straight out of my nightmares. Before me was a fierce inferno, a house burning against a dark horizon, with bodies strewn across a grassy field as bloodthirsty killers whooped and fired their rifles into the air in the foreground. I physically shook as I slowly walked forward across the wet grass which had inexplicably appeared underneath my feet, and felt the heat from the flames against my skin. There were tears rolling down my cheeks as I walked in a daze towards the inferno, and an immense guilt ate away at me. Because, you see, I'd been here before. Back during my mortal existence and the seemingly endless war I'd fought in. The soldiers celebrating this vile atrocity were my former comrades. Soldiers turned crazed killers, dancing in the heat of the fire they'd lit, and there was worse to come. I already knew what to expect, but the horrific scene I was forced to relive almost broke me. On the wet grass were 4 fresh bodies laying outside the burning house, each one showing signs of multiple stab and bullet wounds as their innocent blood seeped into the dark soil. The children were the hardest to see, a boy and girl, both under the age of 10. I assumed they were brother and sister, once full of life and hope, but now lying dead in the dirt, their lifeless eyes staring up at the stars above. Their mother lay beside them, her dress ripped and body exposed. Her mouth was frozen in a horrifying death scream, and I knew she'd seen her children butchered before they finished her off. The last body was that of a white-haired elderly woman, all clad in black. Presumably, she was the children's grandmother, and she'd been shot through the heart. The final look on her wrinkled face was one of pained resignation. I turned away from the bodies in shame, looking with disgust upon my platoon mates who'd committed these murders and now celebrated their wickedness without remorse. I realized then why the tower was showing me this horror from my past. This atrocity was pure evil carried out by the hands of mortal men, and not even the deepest depths of hell could match what we'd done to one another on Earth. I froze where I stood, my emotions overwhelming me as I sobbed uncontrollably and wished the ground would swallow me up. In a way, this is what happened. As the horrifying scene disappeared in front of my eyes, the burning house vanished and the cheering soldiers were pulled into the darkness, and all that was left there were 4 bodies. Except they were no longer the empty vessels of innocent souls. I could only watch in stunned horror as the dead rose, all 4 transformed into something vile and hateful, hissing zombies with ravenous eyes and gaping mouths. They advanced upon me with their bare hands extended like claws, apparently intent on gaining bloody revenge. For a moment, I considered letting them. After all I'd done, I surely deserved this, but no, I wouldn't give in to the tricks of the tower. I had to keep fighting. At this point, I could barely stand, let alone walk, as the pain from my injuries was nearly overwhelming, but somehow I summoned the strength to go on, limping towards the steel door at the far side of the chamber. I could hear the vengeful ghouls behind me, rambling along slowly, but making good progress as they snarled and hissed in spiteful anticipation. I didn't turn around as I shuffled across the cold metal floor, my whole body aching with every movement. I got within 10 yards of the door before I collapsed in exhaustion. No longer able to walk, and so reduced to crawling. The zombies were right on top of me now, grasping and clawing at my dragging legs as I desperately tried to kick them off. I felt helpless as they began to drag me backwards, and I was sure I was done for, but to my immense surprise, the attack ended as abruptly as it had begun. I turned my head in astonishment, only to see the murdered family standing and watching me. They suddenly ended their murderous assault upon me, and their dead eyes were no longer filled with hate. Instead, I saw a deep sadness in the women and children as they looked down upon me. It was almost as if they pitied me. All I could do was make a wholly inadequate apology, mouthing, "I'm so sorry." With that, I turned my back on the victims and continued my slow retreat, finally reaching the door and pushing my way through to the other side. I stumbled in surprise, only just stopping myself from falling over the edge. Amazingly, I'd made it to the summit of the Iron Tower, surviving against all odds. I suppose I should have been relieved to escape the dark and seemingly endless staircase and hellish chambers, but the world I emerged into was hardly an improvement. Instead of sunshine, I was faced with a blood-red sky, and the air was anything but fresh, as my nostrils were filled with the foul stench of death, decay, and burning flesh. My weary eyes slowly scanned downwards as I heard the distant cries and clashes of far-off battles. Several hundred feet below me was the doomed city of Dis. Hell's capital was seemingly infinite, as all I could see in every direction was crumbling buildings and military fortifications. There must have been hundreds of fires burning across the hellscape, and the city streets were full of broken and torn bodies. But most chilling of all were the huge, towering demons who stalked the streets. 60-foot-tall giants whose roars filled the rancid air as they literally stomped on any lost soul still foolish enough to be caught out in the open. These wicked minotaurs were Satan's elite troops, the core of his vile army tasked with crushing Minos' rebellion. I had seen one when I arrived in Dis, but that demon was dispatched by a horde of bloodthirsty zombies fighting for the rebel army. But it seemed the tide had turned. Lucifer's foot soldiers now dominated the battlefield as dozens charged through the city, crushing and destroying everything in their path. I noticed how they were advancing toward a central point, which I realized was the pyramid-like structure where we'd been briefed before we were sent into battle. Satan's forces were surely gunning for Minos, and I reckoned his foolish rebellion would soon be over, but I didn't care about any of this. I was done. The pain overwhelmed me as I collapsed onto the cold metal balcony, the tower's spire above me and the burning city below. I had been promised my freedom if I reached the summit, but it seemed this had been yet another lie. I was distraught and entirely beaten. I did consider throwing myself off the edge, but what would be the point of that? This was hell, and I couldn't die for a second time. It seemed there was no escape, and I was in fact doomed to an eternity of torture and suffering. But suddenly I spotted something in the corner of my eye, a winged creature descending from the crimson sky above. At first it was little more than a dot on the horizon, but the flying entity was coming ever closer and evidently heading straight for me. I didn't have strength to fight or flee. Instead, I merely looked up to see my attacker, but to my surprise, I was temporarily blinded by an intense white light which emanated from the winged creature. I shielded my eyes as the entity landed with a heavy thump on the metal just yards from where I sat. Fearfully, I raised my head to observe the interloper. I expected a harpy or a winged demon, an ugly and fiendish beast from Hell's legions. Instead, I cast my weary eyes upon something ferocious yet beautiful. Towering above me was a tall humanoid figure, easily 12 feet in height, and clad in shining armor which covered her breasts and torso. I say she because the entity was definitely a woman, a stunning creature with long blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, filled with strength but also compassion. She carried a mighty sword which would surely light up even the darkest of places, but she did not draw the weapon to threaten me. Instead, she spoke in a song-like voice which was both booming yet comforting at the same time.
Rest easy, my child. I mean you no harm.
My jaw dropped as I struggled to speak through all the pain and shock. What? Who are you? I eventually muttered. I swore she shot me a smile through her ruby-red lips before responding.
I am Ariel, and I serve the one true Lord.
I was in awe, not believing that something so beautiful could exist in a place so evil. Ariel was an angel, of course, but she was a long way from home. Why are you here? I asked sheepishly.
To observe. Look.
She pointed her sword to the city below, where an epic battle was about to occur. I could barely see him at first, but Minos used his great power to rapidly grow in size, and his body was soon the size of the demons charging towards him. He maintained the form of a bearded giant, but with a thick snake-like appendage wrapped around his immense body. The demons roared as they launched their assaults with fiery swords in hand, but Minos remained calm, using his serpent tail to thrash out and strike the monsters. Several demons fell, their giant bodies collapsing and crushing the buildings behind them, but the attackers kept on coming. Next, Minos used his dark powers to summon fire from thin air, propelling fireballs which consumed the advancing demons. Clearly, Minos was extremely powerful, but he was also heavily outnumbered and soon began to falter under the relentless assaults. Then suddenly the surviving demons stopped their attack, forming a circle to prevent Minos from escaping, but not driving home their advantage. I didn't understand why at first, but then I saw it. Another huge winged beast soared through Hell's sky, but this creature was no angel. Quite the opposite, in fact. I froze upon witnessing the monstrosity. A gigantic dragon colored jet black. The beast was easily the size of a bus, with a vast wingspan, burning red eyes, and a huge maw full of razor-sharp teeth. I had seen the monster before, shortly prior to my entrance to the Iron Tower, and I knew who he was. Lucifer. Satan. Lord of the Flies. The devil was here to deliver bloody vengeance upon the traitor. Minos looked up at the last possible moment, and even from a distance, I could see the terror in the giant black eyes. The beast breathed fire, delivering a stream of white flames which hit Minos from above and set his exposed body alight. The giant cried out in agony as the dragon dived into him with its sharp talons exposed. Minos fought back with whatever strength he had left, using his tail to lash out at the beast. He managed to drive Lucifer back temporarily, but couldn't last for long. I watched in shocked awe as the fire engulfed Minos and Lucifer went in for the kill, knocking his opponent down to the street before he bit deep into the still screaming giant's flesh, eating the traitor while he still lived. I turned away in disgust, not wishing to witness the sickening scene which would surely follow. Instead, I looked to my angelic companion, noting the sadness in her deep blue eyes. "So, it's over?" I said quietly. "Minos' rebellion has failed."
Yes,
Ariel replied with a tone of deep regret.
Lucifer has regained control of his unholy kingdom. His power has been weakened by this civil war, and it will take him some time to recover. But sadly, he will eventually rebuild his armies and once again threaten the mortal realm.
This warning brought a fresh chill through my broken body, but in that moment my thoughts were entirely selfish. What about me? Ariel glared down at me with anger, and I feared I'd made a terrible mistake.
What about you?
The words almost stuck in my throat, but somehow I managed to reply. "I didn't kill that family. I did nothing," was my pathetic justification.
You did nothing.
Ariel replied in an accusatory tone.
You just stood and watched.
And I knew she was right. Perhaps I was right where I belonged. But Ariel wasn't quite done with me yet. She sighed deeply, looking back towards the hellish horizon before speaking again.
Our Lord is merciful. The promises made to you were not his. Nevertheless, he will grant you a second chance at life. However, there are conditions to your release. You must follow a righteous path. We will not tolerate you returning to your old ways, Jacob.
There were tears rolling down my cheeks as I was overwhelmed with uncontrollable emotion. I won't, I spluttered between sobs. Never again! Ariel turned towards me once again, her blue eyes now filled with compassion. She reached out to touch me, and when her hand touched my skin, I was taken by a bright light and pulled from the depths of hell. I can't really explain what happened next. In a blink of an eye, I was back on Earth, back in the muddy field where I'd met my end. I heard the dull click as my boot made contact with the hidden landmine, but my fate had been altered by divine intervention. This time, the mine did not detonate, and I was spared. God had given me a second chance, but I still remembered everything, and so, this is my story. But I see it not as the end, but rather the beginning. I deserted from my unit soon after my near-death experience. I just couldn't face the bloodshed and carnage any longer. I haven't decided to do with my second life, but I know I'll never lift a gun again. Never again will I inflict violence upon my fellow man, and I intend to spend the rest of my mortal existence trying to do some good in this screwed-up world. And that's all I have to say. Peace be with you, my friends.